Released in 2023, Final Fantasy XVI was Square Enix's divisive new step to take their headliner series in a darker, more mature narrative direction. We play as Clive in the politically divided continent of Valistia. The stars of the narrative are the Dominants, a handful of powerful magic users blessed by the elements and able to transform into beasts based on previous Final Fantasy summons. For example, Clive is a Dominant of Fire and able to transform into Ifrit. Being so powerful, these Dominants often hold large influence and are naturally important to the story. Clive's tale of redemption and revenge is a long and complicated one. There are multiple in-game systems, dynamic diagrams, and evolving dictionaries, all to try and help you keep track of it. But we don't have to worry about the main story, because we're not here for Clive, we're here for Dion. Dion Lesage is a son of the Emperor Sanbreque, leader of the Knights Dragoon, and most importantly, the Dominant of Light, able to transform into the icon Bahamut. Dion awoke to his icon abilities as only a baby, and Dion's father, originally just a nobleman, was able to use Dion's child prodigy status to rise to the position of Emperor. While Dion likes to see the best in his father, he's clearly a bit of a manipulator and even killed Dion's birth mother after he was born, since she was just a commoner and he just so happened to be married. A few years before the main events of the game, Dion's father, being as established a bit of a bad egg, conspired with Annabella, Clive's pretty evil former stepmother, to take over Clive's homeland of Rosaria and have Clive's father, the former king of Rosaria and her husband at that point, killed. She would go on to remarry Dion's father, his former wife out of the picture by this point, become an empress, cruelly rule over Rosaria as an ally of Sanbreque, give birth to Dion's pretty unnerving younger half-brother Olivier, and most importantly, be a pretty awful stepmother to Dion. She is a busy woman. It's a pretty complicated series of events, but these two, nasty work. That leads us to where Dion is introduced around halfway through the story, fighting battles as a revered icon Bahamut on behalf of his father's empire, but becoming more and more disapproving of his increasingly vicious leadership style. However, Dion feels unable to verbalize this, knowing that his manipulative stepmother will be able to turn his father against him in an instant, and feeling a frankly character-defining sense of dedication to protect and serve the citizens of his nation, stopping him from wanting to step too far out of line. Dion still respects his father, since apparently he used to be a more kind ruler, but now he's obsessed with expanding territory, uncaring how this impacts his civilians, and Dion believes it's all Annabella's influence. In spite of not believing in the battles he's leading, Dion still tries to use his sway as a widely respected dominant to avoid as much killing as possible. Recovering from a battle and having his injuries treated by his right hand... oh.
That's right folks, the King of Dragons is gay.
Dion's attendant, bodyguard, second-in-command, childhood best friend Terence also happens to be his boyfriend, or if we use a game's vocabulary, lover. They studied together in school since they were 7, he was officially appointed to Dion's side at 12, and at 18, after protecting Terence in battle, he stayed by Dion's side to help him heal, and they finally admitted to having feelings for each other and began their relationship. This chaste kiss is also why you won't find Final Fantasy XVI on the shelves of any Saudi retailers. Anyway, before they can sodomize each other, they're rudely interrupted by a messenger informing Dion that he's no longer in line for the throne, and the position is being taken by his, and I really can't emphasize this enough, creepy younger brother Olivier. Dion is rightfully pissed knowing that Annabella's manipulation is to blame, but before he can make any solid plans to confront his father, he's interrupted by Joshua, Clive's thought to be dead but not actually younger half-brother, and Annabella's first son was the now dead king of Rosaria. Joshua is much more important to the main Clive-centric plot, and if you've been paying attention, the family tree between Clive, Joshua, Dion and Olivier is now pretty convoluted thanks to the one and only. Joshua reveals that the mysterious main antagonist Ultima is planning to use Clive as a vessel to enter the corporeal world, but more importantly to Dion, Ultima has likely been possessing Dion's father and influencing Sanbreque's politics, explaining why Dion's dad is being so awful. Incensed by this information, Dion leads the Dragoons in a rebellion against the rest of Sanbreque's forces, and confronts his father in person, believing that Ultima hasn't possessed him, but instead Olivier. He also points out that Annabella has a bit of a track record for betraying her husbands, but his father's not listening, so instead he tries to take out the source of the corruption, Olivier, with a well-placed javelin. However, all the good aim in Valistia couldn't stop his father from jumping in to save his creepy son, with him taking the hit and dying instead. Annabella, of course, freaks out, but Olivier doesn't seem too torn up by this, since Dion was right and Ultima was possessing Olivier. He taunts Dion through his creepy little vessel, telling him that this is all part of his plan to trigger Dion into losing control and to test Clive's power as a future vessel, and since Dion just accidentally killed his dad, it works. Overcome by, well, everything, Dion transforms into a raging Bahamut, attacking his home city, and it's up to Clive and Joshua to stop him. The brothers are able to defeat him, and in what seems like his dying moments, Dion, in an attempt to redeem his father, uses the last of his strength to kill Olivier, who, like the little weirdo he is, dissipates, since he was being possessed by an otherworldly evil. This leaves Annabella, her scheming finally all caught up with her, and the only son she saw any worth in dead, and also faced with Joshua, the son she thought died years ago. She goes fully mad. mad and quite brutally kills herself, leaving a neat ribbon on the end of Dion's narrative. However, Dion doesn't die. He's dragged away to safety by Clive and Joshua and recovers under their care. As soon as he's awake, he goes to see the damage he caused during his rampage in Sanbreque, and there's a lot of it, and he quickly passes out from the grief, but is found and taken into the care of a young orphan healer. Face to face with the consequences of Bahamut's rage and the immeasurable loss of civilian life, the civilians he thought he was doing this all on behalf of, even though it wasn't technically his fault, Dion understandably needs to take some time out the limelight for wallowing in self-reflection. In spite of the destruction, Dion still has the support of his dragoons, of course including Terence, and he ends up aligning with Clive and Joshua, with him and his forces aiding in many of the battles throughout the third act. Dion eventually ends up parting ways with Terence and the Dragoons to go and live at Clive's base, the Hideaway, for the last few hours of the game, but before he makes Terence promise him to seek out and care for the orphan girl who healed him, Terence can clearly tell this is a final goodbye, with the battle against Ultima ramping up and the pair share a tearful parting. During Dion's brief stint living at the Hideaway, he reunites with his childhood tutor Harpocrates, who his lessons were cut short with thanks to his early enlistment as Dragoon. In a touching moment, Harpocrates offers Dion a wild Wyvern-tail flower, a mutated version of the flower shown to be a representation of Dion's familial ties in the early cutscenes. Harpocrates explains it's a flower whose eventual colour isn't dictated by its roots, a message to Dion that he won't be defined by his history. Dion is unable to accept the gift however, claiming that he'll only take it once he's fully made amends, once again displaying his deep-set guilt. Dion doesn't have to wait long for his chance however, using his power as Bahamut to lead the climactic battle against Ultima alongside Clive and Joshua. Alas, Dion doesn't make it to the final arena, dying in a heroic act of self-sacrifice during the flight to Ultima's domain, using his last moments to clear the way forward for the other two. Ironically, falling toward the ground as he's about to die is the happiest we ever see Dion, finally content that he's redeemed not only his own actions, but the actions of his father as well. His story ends tragically, but all threads pay off and wrap together to create a rewarding narrative. So, considering all of that, is Dion a good gay character? In my opinion, Dion is one of, if not the best written character in Final Fantasy XVI, hands down. His narrative relevance with such a limited screen time, his rollercoaster of a storyline and dutiful personality all make him a well-characterized star, but that wasn't what I asked. Even before Final Fantasy XVI was on shelves, we knew Dion was going to be gay. Before we knew anything about his storyline or personality, we knew Dion was going to be a real man's man. Being a gay character, especially in such a high-profile game, means that Dion is automatically a piece in the never-ending, ever-controversial conversation surrounding representation. While you might hear that the topic of gay representation should be over and solved by now thanks to an arbitrary goalpost like gay marriage laws or the existence of characters like Dion, it's clear that if you just take a small step back and look at the gaming sphere, that's not the case. Even if you ignore something as old as the history of censorship of gay characters or the recent debates surrounding characters that are woke, DEI, or whatever new term has been colonized by them, there's still the conversation about what makes a good gay character. You might think it's as simple as having a character be gay, but of course it isn't. These aren't real people, they're characters. Are they too much of a stereotype? Do they shove being gay in your face? Do they not shove being gay in your face enough? Are they a well-developed character on top of being gay? Are they important to the story? Then you've got to remember I'm talking about games. Do you play as them? Can they be avoided in-game? Does a game force you to be gay? Does having gay people break immersion? Will including gay characters alienate the player base, harm sales, and sabotage any chance of the series continuing? It's exhausting, and just because you might not care about one of these points, I can guarantee that plenty of other people do. That's the crux of it really. We're being pulled in so many different directions that it's hard to tell which opinions we should and shouldn't care about. And for that matter, who's we? I'm not an authority, I'm just some gay guy. I can't speak on behalf of all gay people. Is Dion a good gay character? I can't really say, not yet at least. What I can do is look at some of his colleagues to get my bearings. Whether you want to acknowledge it or not, that heap of questions I just listed, and that's only really scraping the surface, have been brought up time and time again with pretty much every other gay character of note in gaming before. Dion exists within the context of these characters, so I'm going to go through some of the most important, use them to unpack those questions, and return to Dion after with a more informed perspective to see if I can answer if he's one of the good ones. Just a quick disclaimer before getting to the other examples, if you were listening to that last section and thought that some of the points I mentioned were applicable to other underrepresented groups in gaming or just media in general, you'd be right. I've chosen to focus on gay men, or more generally men who are attracted to other men, MLM, Achilleans, fudge packers, whatever you want to call them, and that's because there's specific nuances to talking about different underrepresented groups, and while there are definitely points that overlap between different groups, I don't want to dilute and generalize what I'm saying to try and include every group. That would be too vague, and I think it's more interesting to explore those aforementioned nuances. On top of that, I'm choosing to talk about a group that, if you couldn't tell, I'm a part of, and while you can of course discuss issues related to groups you're not a part of, I do think that being in that group does make it come a little more naturally and means you can talk on certain topics with more innate authority. I could go on, but one more thing I want to point out is that this lack of coverage for other underrepresented groups shouldn't be misinterpreted for not being interested or devaluing the importance of those conversations. But with that out of the way, onto the head homo. You can't talk about gay characters in gaming without acknowledging the elephant in the room that is Dorian Pavis from Dragon Age Inquisition. For a few years that would have gone unquestioned, but it's now been well over a decade since Inquisition launched, and I don't think I can just say that without explanation anymore and expect people to follow. And since it's been so long, I think those who remember Dorian's impact might still need a refresher. So who is Dorian? Dragon Age Inquisition, the third entry in BioWare's Dragon Age series, released in late 2014 to wide critical acclaim, going on to win the very first Game of the Year award that year. In it, you play as a player-customized Inquisitor, sole survivor of an explosion that tore a giant breach and multiple smaller rifts between the world of Thedas, the main setting, and the Fade, a dimension full of demons, spirits, and such. In surviving the explosion, the Inquisitor gains the power to fix the rifts, and with some new allies forms the Inquisition, an organisation to defend the world against otherworldly dangers and fix a lot of rifts in the process. There's a lot more to it than that, of course, it's Dragon Age, but if you want more details there are much better summaries than the ones I just gave that go into more detail. What is important is that on the Inquisitor's adventure they meet Dorian. How exactly you meet Dorian depends on an in-game choice, but the choice that gives him a bit more narrative relevance will have the Inquisitor meeting him during a quest to align with the mages, where he has to aid the Inquisitor in defeating his former, now corrupted mentor, who is aiding the villainous Venatori. Depending on your choices during this quest, you can invite him to join the Inquisition and become a party member. He's a mage specialising in necromancy hailing from the nation of Tevinter, a mageocracy being a government that prioritises the nation's mages above anything else, with a deeply entrenched class system and open practice of slavery. Having defected from his homeland, Dorian is vocal about their issues, yet occasionally defensive of their culture, especially given that he was raised as nobility, but this also makes him all the more aware of the suffocating societal expectations placed on him. Dorian is witty, charming, and has a wry sense of humour, but he's not without his flaws.
He's snobby, condescending, sarcastic, vain and childish. He's an emotionally stumped alcoholic who loves provoking fights for the sake of drama. He's an intellectually gifted and magically talented elitist who also happens to be incredibly handsome, and he shamelessly flaunts all three to anyone who happens to be nearby.
While Dorian can be present and a party member for many of the main quests and will have plenty to say in ambient commentary, he's unfortunately not that important to the main narrative of Inquisition. He really gets to shine however during side content, particularly his romance. After Dorian joins a party you can go and flirt with him whenever you're so inclined, and eventually Dorian will start to return the affection. Once Dorian and the Inquisitor are close enough, you'll be informed of a letter that arrived at the Inquisition base from Dorian's estranged father, asking for him to meet a family retainer in a neutral location. You're told not to tell Dorian about the letter and just try and get him to go, but for best romancing results, it's best to tell him anyway so as to not break his trust. Upon reaching the meeting spot and acting as moral support for Dorian, you'll discover no such retainer and it's actually Dorian's father himself. This of course angers the mage, who'll reveal to the Inquisitor his reason for running from his family is because of his homosexuality and that he was unwilling to take part in an arranged marriage and father a child with his betrothed.
Powerful houses fight for dominance and vie for the perfection of their bloodlines through careful matchmaking strategies, following politics and practices that are reminiscent of eugenics. Being openly gay and refusing to perpetuate his bloodline with a female companion chosen for him, Dorian's backstory involves him running counter his father's plans, since every perceived flaw, every aberration is deviant and shameful in Tevinter.
In his desperation for his son to follow Tevinter tradition and continue their legacy, Dorian's father planned for a blood magic ritual to be done on Dorian without his consent in an attempt to change his sexuality, an experimental procedure that could have easily ended in total mental failure if botched. But Dorian's father is here to beg forgiveness and try and reconcile with his understandably upset son. Depending on your choices, you can encourage Dorian to patch things up with his father or leave without accepting the apology. Upon returning to the base, no matter which choice you made, you can choose to console and support Dorian, let him talk through his feelings with the Inquisitor, and then kiss him to officially romance him. While this is the meat of the relationship, you'll get more scenes with him throughout the game, giving more depth to his romance with the Inquisitor, including the choice for them to become official. Dorian ends the Inquisition, returning to Tevinter to rebuild and hopefully reshape his home nation, and if romanced, he'll gift the Inquisitor a sending crystal so they can stay in contact long distance. In spite of being far from the centre of the drama for most of the main narrative of Inquisition, Dorian forges his path into the spotlight by stealing pretty much any scene he gets a chance to open his mouth in, and he does all of this while being openly, and I mean this is no insult, very gay, and like it or not, that became a large part of his legacy. Not only is Dorian a romance option for a male Inquisitor, he's only an option for a male Inquisitor. While there are now quite a lot of options for gay romances in games, very few of them are exclusively gay. In games with multiple romance options, there are still plenty of characters who will be exclusively in straight romances, and those that are given the option to be in a same-sex romance will still usually be an option for straight romances as well. But it is very rare to have a character who will exclusively go for the same gender even now. And before you bring up population percentages and how a small minority don't need this much representation, believe me when I say it's still underrepresented. This doesn't inherently make Dorian a better gay character in gaming, but it does make him a rarer one. Being gay isn't just a trivia point for Dorian either. As you saw, it's a major focal point for his narrative and backstory. His core emotional arc, while not being about accepting his sexuality, he's clearly got that part out of the way, is about accepting how his sexuality has drastically altered his relationship with his family and his homeland, and how it's made him a more emotionally guarded person.
Dorian is 30 years old. Whatever defensive coping mechanisms he has developed over the years have become so intertwined with his personality that they are now fully part of who he is.
Head writer for Dorian in Inquisition, David Gader, made a whole post dedicated to explaining the importance of Dorian's sexuality to his storyline.
Of course, a character being gay is not a substitute for them having goals or character development, but in this case, Dorian's role in the game was more or less already established. Homophobia didn't exist in Thedas per se, but Tevinter society has a very rigid set of requirements regarding what was accepted behaviour for their elite citizens. You have to look the part, and more than that, you had to devote yourself to a good marriage and to your family's cause. Anything less than that and you were a pariah, too weak to even maintain the expected facade. If you couldn't manage that, after all, then how competent could you truly be? Dorian is someone who rejected that life, despite all the benefits it could offer and despite his parents' worries and best intentions, because living truthfully meant more to him.
Dorian's character arc was specifically written with his sexuality in mind, and he would not be the same character if that wasn't the case, and that is where a lot of the complaints about Dorian come from. Why does a gay character have to have their storyline defined by being gay?
Okay, fine, you win with your gay stuff.
While Dorian is a popular character, he isn't without his share of detractors, and there seems to be one criticism that most arguments against him share.
Some read him as a gay stereotype and stated that his storyline focuses too much on his sexuality. My real issue with Dorian is that he's mostly there for the sake of there being a gay guy. Forced as fuck. Ham-fisted and cliched. A poor attempt at a good gay storyline. I'm disappointed in BioWare for his personal arc. Most writers seem to have yet to realise that gay characters can have personal issues that are unrelated to their gayness.
Like I said, Dorian's narrative is steeped in his sexuality, and while he would still have a personality without it, his storyline would look completely different if his sexuality wasn't a factor. But even then, his personality was also an issue, since it's also defined by his sexuality.
We are not all flamboyant, sex-crazed, walking stereotypes IRL, so why are we being represented this way? Yet another BioWare trademarked daddy issue character. I'm almost surprised he doesn't come pre-packaged with a limp wrist, a handbag and some lip gloss and an iPod filled with Cher's greatest hits, since they're clearly trying to go for the offensive stereotype with him. He's practically Freddie Mercury's more magically inclined twin. I find him annoying and arrogant, to be honest.
And it's not just his personality either, but how he looks too.
The moustache is a perfect illustration of Dorian's reading as a stereotype, as it is also reminiscent of those found in the artwork of Tom of Finland. Famous for his homoerotic drawings, Dorian's muscles and moustache are very similar to Finland's policemen, sailors and leather men. If they didn't want to add a gay character, why didn't they just leave it at that instead of producing this grotesque parody of what people thought a homosexual looked like back in the 1950s?
But not only was Dorian's storyline centered around being gay, not only was his personality and appearance heavily inspired by common gay iconography, but BioWare couldn't help themselves and openly marketed Dorian as a gay character as well. Months before release, Dorian's sexuality reached headlines before his actual name. Dragon Age Inquisition writer talks series' first gay character.
I hate the way they try and promote him and say, hey, look at our gay character. I feel like they lessen him and make him just a token minority. I take issue with characters being advertised as gay. If a character's most prominent trait is their sexual orientation, that is a sign of poor writing.
While some of these complaints touch on more valid points than others, and I don't want to just dismiss them all with a sweeping statement, a common theme that underlies all of them is a prominence of Dorian's sexuality. There's a desire for gay characters to just happen to be gay, and a suggestion that the more a character addresses and brings attention to their sexuality, the more it detracts from the quality of their writing. There isn't an issue with Dorian being gay, and perish the thought that they're implying anything homophobic, but why is Dorian always going on about being gay?
What BioWare should have done, and what most video game producers should do, is make their character's sexuality and gender identity a secret. Don't completely hide it away, but drop hints and clues in their character's dialogue. Make finding out their sexuality trivia and something that the player has to find out on their own, and not just get told about.
It's tempting to respond to my bespoke collection of Dorian criticisms with something along the lines of, Dorian, not just Dorian but gay characters in general, should be allowed to be vocally gay. Fuck off. But that would be reductive. So instead I want to address how Dorian is a great example of how a character's narrative can be enhanced, not limited, by having such a strong focus on sexuality. Fantasy discrimination is a powerful narrative device when used effectively, but I think we're all aware of how heavy-handed and immersion-breaking it can be when used clumsily. One of the most egregious recent examples is actually Final Fantasy XVI, with the introduction of bearers, people who are naturally gifted at magic, but thanks to the laws of the world, immediately enslaved and branded, forced to use their magic until their body gives out and they turn to stone. It's an interesting premise, and there are plenty of memorable side quests that have you interacting with bearers. Clive even spends a lot of the game acting as a bearer, but they're unfortunately never given much narrative weight and feel like an underdeveloped and badly thought out attempt to make the world feel grittier. A much more successful example is Metaphor ReFantasio, a game with a whole host of different races called tribes, all of which have an interesting place in the world and the narrative. While reflecting clearly on real-world racism, it's never too on the nose to feel like a parody, instead adding depth to the setting, making the world more interesting to explore and learn about. It's a risk since it's a big swing, and if you miss, it can be cringe-inducing, but if you succeed, it will make your game all the more memorable for the right reasons. So where does Dorian fit into this? Dorian's story is a weird hybrid approach to fantasy discrimination, since being gay isn't a fantasy concept, at least I don't think it is, but being gay has a unique impact on Dorian's life because he's in a fantasy setting. While Tevinter is an important nation within Inquisition, we never actually visit it in person during the story, so having Dorian as a sole party member from this nation gives a unique and valuable insight into Tevinter culture. We know that Tevinter is an elitist nation where magical capability is put above all, and Dorian's narrative exemplifies that. Relationships between nobles aren't based on romance, but instead breeding capability, to hone magical ability with each generation in hopes that your house can gain influence by having the most magically powerful children possible. It's fantasy eugenics, and its existence and description by Dorian paints a vivid picture of what his life in Tevinter was like. Its importance is reinforced when you learn that Dorian's father was willing to go to such lengths to force his son to change for a dangerous experimental blood magic procedure, not because he has a particular moral or religious issue with Dorian being gay, but Dorian's insistence on being publicly gay, refusing to enter a fake marriage and have children, is a direct defiance of his culture and breeding. Dorian was born with the eventual purpose to sire children unquestioningly.
It is not Dorian's desire for other men that upsets his father, but his inability, and more importantly, his refusal to produce an heir. There is therefore a nuance here between the idea that Dorian's father potentially tolerates his son's sexuality but does not accept its consequences.
It's an obvious parallel to conversion therapy, parents putting their children in harm's way to potentially change their sexuality. It's hardly well hidden, but the way it's twisted to be justified in this setting doesn't just make Dorian a more engaging character, it also serves to flesh out the world as it exists around him. It makes Tevinter a more palpable setting without ever actually going there, and it characterises why Dorian has such a rebellious streak, but also such foundational trust issues, and also why near the end of the story he's dead set on returning to Tevinter to hopefully change it for the better. And so it shifts back to why Dorian's narrative revolves so heavily around his sexuality. He represents how your sexuality will change how you interact with the world. There are characters in the wider gaming sphere who have their sexuality as more of a background focus, and even in Inquisition itself with characters like Iron Bull and Josephine, and that's fine and to be expected. However, it's unrealistic to overlook that some characters who are gay might have been affected by their sexuality in more notable ways, and they might have the audacity to mention it, like Dorian. As seen here, it doesn't break immersion but only makes the world feel more real. I fear the "we're just like you, we're completely normal, we could be anyone" narrative has gone so far that acknowledging that you're gay and that it might change how you interact with the world is treated like it's obnoxious. There is value in those narratives, especially for gay youth who feel a need to fit in, but an unintended side effect that sometimes comes across is that if you're a noticeably gay person, that's a kind of moral failing. While I completely understand the normalization aspect of it, it doesn't do anyone any good to act like we're all at equal standing. Saying it shouldn't matter is a lovely sentiment, I appreciate the passive activism, but it's used so often as a very weak way of dressing up I don't care, and if you want to say that, then say it with your chest. It's a point Dorian's defenders don't hesitate to verbalise.
To say that the game shouldn't care they're gay is a little ridiculous, when in real life people really do care if you are gay or not, and obviously that affects your life. Sexuality is a huge part of a person's life experience, doubly so if they find themselves outside established cultural norms. No reason why it shouldn't be more than a passing reference. I don't find it any more progressive to ignore every queer character's sexuality than it's progressive to make every queer character revolve around their sexuality. There's been 10 queer love interests in Dragon Age so far. 9 of those make it a complete non-issue. I think it's great to have a character whose sexuality is important, especially when it fits within the context of the narrative and when it's not the sole defining characteristic. Because sexuality is important. It's important to me and it's important to Dorian. It's part of what made me who I am and part of what made Dorian who he is. Demanding that every queer character approach it identically and nonchalantly is reductive, especially when that's already in place as the rule rather than the exception.
And the ironic thing is, Dorian does address this nonchalantly. Even though he has every right to, Dorian doesn't woe is me his way through the game. You'll only learn about Dorian's conversion therapy if you actively seek it out in Dorian's companion quest, and even when he talks about it there, he's reserved about his struggles and tries to brush it off, and will unless you really pry. But aside from that, Dorian just fucking loves being gay. He'll shamelessly flirt with a male Inquisitor, calling him handsome or strapping if you give him an inch, and if you don't romance him and leave Ironball free, he'll start flirting with him instead. Try as you might, Dorian will pry his way out of any closet. The pairing of Dorian and Ironball is arguably just as popular as Dorian and the Inquisitor, especially since they're both actual characters and neither is character created. Throughout this section, I've quoted Pellison's dissertation on Dorian a few times. They unintentionally or not ended up archiving a lot of now deleted forum posts that would have otherwise been inaccessible. In their essay, they've got a whole dedicated section exploring Dorian and Ironball there, so I'd recommend reading it if you want to know more about the pairing. I wouldn't really know since I'm incapable of playing Inquisition without romancing Dorian. Pellison's essay also quantifies a point I want to clarify, that Dorian is a widely appreciated character. While I was able to find plenty of complaints about him, I mean of course I was, he's a gay character in a mainstream game, these are very much in the minority.
Out of 162 comments debating whether Dorian was a stereotypical character, only 9 considered Dorian to be a negative stereotype, and 21 expressed mixed views.
I'm not going to try and pretend that my point of view is in the minority to make it more juicy. Dorian's a great character and most people know that, but of course you can't please everyone. When discussing Dorian like this, it's easy to say that he's defined by his sexuality, and while there's nothing inherently wrong with that, it's just not even wholly true for him. Aside from his shameless flirting, his personality shines in ambient dialogue. He'll nearly always have a unique perspective on plot developments, and his complex relationship with Tevinter isn't just defined by his personal trauma. Tevinter's class structure is rigid, and it's one of the few nations in Phaedas that still openly practices slavery, and while Dorian could easily gloss over this being born into high society, he doesn't. But he's also aware of how challenging it would be to reform a whole country. It's why he gets so defensive around other characters who make generalizations about Tevinter, since while he knows they're making valid points, he wants them to know that not everyone from Tevinter is complicit or approving in the way their society is built. You'll often hear that a good gay character is one that just happens to be gay, but if that was the case, we wouldn't have a character like Dorian. But Dorian's a good character, it's a catch-22. Sure, being gay is something that just happens. It occurs naturally, apparently, but it will impact your life whether you want to acknowledge it or not. Being in the closet for however long tends to arrest or sometimes accelerate development, and even in the most accepting countries, there will still be a notable percentage of the population who don't accept your existence. And I'm not even going to get into the history of laws surrounding sexuality because it's just depressing. This isn't begging for pity, it's just pointing out the reality, because depending on the environment you're in, it's sometimes easy to forget. I bring it up because it's a human experience, and human experiences influence the best characters, and that's how we ended up with Dorian. You don't need me to tell you that you're allowed to dislike Dorian, but there's a stark difference between not liking him because of his stupid mustache or the fact that his nipple's almost always peeking out, and not liking him because he talks about being gay. That being said, Dorian is an undeniably good guy. He's fighting for what's right and the story is very much on his side. It makes him an easy gay character to like, since it feels like the right thing to do. But what if Dorian was a bit more of an asshole? When talking about queerness in Life is Strange, the conversation understandably usually goes to the relationship between Max and Chloe from the first game, or perhaps it goes to a different game from Don't Nod like Tell Me Why. While there are interesting conversations to be had about both of those, I instead want to talk about the debatable quality of the relationship between Sean and Finn from Life is Strange 2. Split into 5 playable episodes released between 2018 and 19, the sequel to the original Life is Strange doesn't have much of a connection to the first. We follow 16-year-old Sean Diaz and his 9-year-old younger brother Daniel, following the unjust killing of their father and the awakening of Daniel's telekinetic powers where he accidentally kills a police officer who shot their father. Sean decides that they need to go on the run from their home in Seattle, aiming for the Mexican border in hopes of reaching safety in their father's hometown. The first episode follows, if you can believe it, the tumultuous start of the siblings' journey, ending with them living in an abandoned cabin in the woods, with Sean helping Daniel train his burgeoning psychic powers in secret. However, after Daniel starts to get ill at the start of the second episode, Sean decides that they need to go and stay with their maternal grandparents in Oregon. It's a busy chapter, but what's worth keeping in mind is that during a visit to the Christmas market, Sean meets Finn and Cass, 2 free-world young travellers settling wherever they can find temporary work to maintain their lifestyle. Sean and Daniel unfortunately don't get too much time living with their grandparents, since the police manage to track down their location and they have to make an emotional and stress-inducing escape, ending the episode by jumping on a freight train. And so we've reached our destination. Episode 3, Wastelands. While not the narrative climax of Life is Strange 2, it is the romantic core of the game, with the option of 2 characters for Sean to choose between. Kind of. Starting after another time skip, by reading Sean's journal we can fill in the blanks that the brothers struggled for a while after getting off the freight train, but were lucky enough to run into Finn and Cass again, and thanks to their connections, managed to get a job working at an off-grid cannabis farm in California. The episode starts with Sean waking up to find Daniel and Finn throwing knives together. Not as dramatic as it sounds though. Finn immediately tells Sean that Daniel has somehow managed to hit 6 bullseyes in a row, so Sean immediately works out that Daniel is using his powers to cheat. The brothers get in a small argument since Sean thinks Daniel needs to be more careful about hiding his powers in front of other people, but Daniel, being irresponsible and well, 9, disagrees. It doesn't help that Finn is essentially being the cool older brother Daniel wants, while Sean is in Daniel's eyes a stick in the mud, when in reality he's just trying to keep Daniel safe. Before they can get too frustrated with each other, Finn calms them down, flirts with Sean a bit and they move on. Later on in the day, after getting back from a shift at the farm and having another argument with Daniel, Sean is lingering on his way back to the camp, so Finn hangs back with him to chat. Finn takes, as usual, just about every chance he can to flirt, while also letting Sean air his frustrations about Daniel and how he's too young to fully comprehend everything he's gone through. But Finn gives Sean the advice to maybe be a little more relaxed with Daniel. This is also where we get some backstory for Finn, learning that he's also a younger brother like Daniel. Him and his older brothers grew up helping their dad with his illegal car stealing and selling business until they got caught, and while the brothers refused to rat out their dad, he instead ratted them out. All 3 of Finn's older brothers are still in prison, but since Finn was too young at the time, he got out much earlier. He's obviously quite angry at the world for the whole situation, but it led him to meeting the friends he travels with, so being as chill as he typically is, he's pretty much over it. In between bigger story beats, Sean can go and chat with Finn while he's wood carving and even draw him if he wants. During a campfire chat between all the drifters working at the farm, Finn mentions that if they had more money, he'd love to just live with all of them by the beach. Later on, he'll walk Daniel back to his tent after Sean refuses to walk with him, wanting to stay a little longer. The girls pressure Sean into finally getting a haircut, and if he agrees, Finn returns with a questionable Scottish accent to give Sean the trim. After the haircut, this is where we learn that Finn and another worker, Hannah, are casually sleeping with each other, and Sean takes the opportunity to ask Finn his sexuality, and Finn answers that he doesn't really care about gender, and when Sean is asked the same question, the player can choose whether to say if he's attracted to men or not, and of course if you do, surprise surprise, Finn will take the opportunity to flirt.
Sean's sexuality is more directed by player input since you choose to sexualize him or not, but there is an option which confirms that Sean is bi-curious at the very least, and he has had some level of attraction to other males in the past, but he has never had a chance to act on it. Sean had always viewed himself as straight prior to Life on the Run. One of the good things to come out of all of his travelling and having more knowledge of the world and people means that Sean gets to learn about himself and who he really is. In the case of this episode, it leads him to start questioning his sexuality, but since he's surrounded by so many open-minded people, there's no angst over it.
On what should have been their payday, everyone gets shafted after Daniel gets caught sneaking about by Merrill, the farm owner, so no one gets paid and Sean and Daniel get fired. There's a scuffle and in front of Finn, Cass and Jacob, another one of the workers, Daniel uses his powers to try and help Sean. Luckily, after an explanation, they all promise to keep Daniel's secret since Merrill didn't actually see Daniel use his telekinesis. Before separating for the night, Finn suggests to Sean, Daniel and Cass that they should use Daniel's power to rob Merrill's safe before the brothers have to leave. Cass immediately disagrees, making the very good point that it's putting, and I really can't emphasize this enough, a 9-year-old in serious danger. While Finn argues back that it could be a life-changing amount of money, he quickly relents when it seems like no one's on his side. Later on, at what should have been Sean and Daniel's last minute leaving just got fired party, Sean can go and have a chat with Finn, who as it turns out hasn't abandoned his idea. Sean reveals that he has nowhere near enough money saved to make it to Mexico, so Finn takes the opportunity to bring the heist plan back up as an opportunity for the brothers to make the money they need. It's a hard choice, but if you want to romance Finn, you have to agree. And if you do, Finn is overcome with the whole situation and starts talking about the strong connection he feels with Sean, and if you go along with it, the pair kiss. You can do some busy work before heading out for the heist, but eventually you'll need to leave to attempt the robbery. If you can wrap your head around it, in spite of his confidence, Finn's last minute plan doesn't go off without a hitch, and Sean, Daniel and Finn get caught. When it looks like Sean's about to get shot, Daniel loses control of his powers, Meryl is killed, Finn is knocked out and Sean's left eye is impaled, and in the frenzy, Daniel runs, the chapter ending with the brothers separated. The relationship between Sean and Finn is atypical for a queer romance in video games. Sexuality is only really given a passing mention, Finn will flirt with Sean whether you start romancing him or not, and in spite of the intensity of their feelings, it's a more casual relationship without strict boundaries, perhaps more representative of the reality of a lot of gay relationships that often don't get displayed in gaming. That's why you might find it surprising that in spite of all the boundary pushing, Sean and Finn are a pretty unpopular pairing.
Wastelands is out now and features a same-sex relationship option for protagonist Sean. The trouble is, it's a bit shite.
Sure, Finn has some fans, but his romance is generally considered to not be a great option for Sean. There are plenty of specific reasons for this, but they can mostly be boiled down to Finn being the bad choice. Life is Strange is a series all about choices. While there is a game hidden amongst all the story and cutscenes, the most interactive element by far are the choices that you'll make. The importance of these choices is repeatedly emphasized, and you're regularly made aware that there will not just be short-term consequences, but long-term as well. And they're right, it's not much of a spoiler, but every big and small choice is contributing to an invisible, untrackable morality meter that will inevitably impact which ending you get. Sean romancing Finn isn't just a choice in who he's romancing, but a major choice in how episode 3 will end. Sean won't get the chance to complete the romance as Finn if he doesn't agree to do the heist as Daniel. As soon as you've committed to either doing the heist or not, you've made your choice on whether you can romance Finn. While a lot of the choices throughout Life is Strange 2 are morally grey, and it's hard to tell whether you're doing the right thing or not, this is not one of them. Siding with Finn is undoubtedly the bad choice. Arguably the only good thing to come out of it is that brief moments of getting the romance scene, and then, oh god, you have to follow through.
Finn's relationship with Sean has moments of genuine connection, but no matter what route the player takes, it always comes second to his ambition. But to go by the Finn route, you've gotta be a horrible human being, make all the bad decisions and treat everyone around you like trash, or to just get a 5-second kiss scene. Locking that romance option behind willingly using a child to rob a drug boss was dumb. There was no way I was going to be okay with that. I don't really like the LGBTQ community, so this was a huge win for me.
Finn isn't a bad person, but he has bad traits, and choosing to romance him means you can't avoid validating his worst side. Sure, he wants to do the heist to help Sean and Daniel get the money they need, but he also wants a cut of the money himself. And you can't argue that he isn't aware of the risk. Cass literally shouts him down, he pretends to have given up, and then he sneaks off to get a moment alone with Sean to try and convince him without any pesky naysayers to influence his decision. Unless you've used a guide, you won't even know this is how you romance Finn, so even if you know he's a romance option, you could very easily miss it if you didn't know this was the only way to trigger it. But perhaps the worst part is, even if you choose to deny him and avoid the romance, the heist will still happen. Finn sneaks behind Sean's back, fully aware of the influence he has over Daniel, and convinces him to do the heist anyway. Brotherhood and the relationship between Sean and Daniel is a main theme and emotional core of the entirety of Life is Strange 2, so putting Daniel directly in harm's way, especially when you spend most of the game trying to avoid that, is clearly against the game's message and moral lens. Finn is a multifaceted character with a great sense of humour and a unique place in the story, but this is by far his worst hour, and it just so happens to be when you need to commit to whether Sean should romance him or not. Finn's, and I'm not being harsh here, abject villainy in this moment is made even worse when you compare it to the other romance option, the positively angelic by comparison Cass. While romancing Finn feels like intentionally walking off a cliff, Cass is considerably easier. She's just as charming and likeable as Finn, but to romance her you don't have to make any particularly hard choices. Sean can, with a few exceptions, act however he wants for episode 3, and Cass will still be down. You can see just how many people took this option when looking at the stats at the end of the chapter. Cass is undoubtedly the more popular option, and that makes sense.
It's worth noting there is more romance content if you pursue Cassidy. Sean can potentially have sex with Cassidy, but he may only share a kiss with Finn. Cass is not only one of the healthiest depictions of fleeting teen romance in the series, it features some of the most sophisticated writing of love and sex the game has had. The sex scene between her and Sean, which is awkward, a little messy, but doubles down on the importance of consent, trust, and making sure an inexperienced partner is comfortable at all times.
While the additional content with Cass upsets some players, I do think this aspect is definitely easier to understand when considering Sean as the protagonist.
Depending on the player's choices, Finn represents Sean's first step in exploring his sexuality, and with this in mind, his interactions with Finn are understandably more cautious.
That makes sense. However, putting everything into context, some players looked at the hard facts of the romance in episode 3 and came to the conclusion that Don't Nod were positioning the straight romance as a good route and the gay one as a bad route.
Even if you spent the rest of the episode speaking with him, sketching him and building up a true bond, you'll be locked in the friend zone if you tell him the robbery is a bad idea. In short, being virtuous and straight will still lead to sex, but travelling down a darker path nets you a single gay kiss.
While I don't want to get too much into it, for some fans of the series this is a continuation of Don't Nod's disagreeable queer representation from the first game.
Overall, Life is Strange 2 didn't improve upon the way the queer relationships are handled compared to their first game, by placing the heterosexual romance option as the moral option. Fans of the game are often perplexed as to why Life is Strange claims to care about queer representation, while they continue to promote such a harmful trope.
On top of this, there were even questions of whether Sean and Finn have enough chemistry to even justify starting a relationship, with some going as far as to call it an afterthought included purely for the sake of diversity. Considering all of this, it mars Finn with the perception that he's a messy, lacking, shoehorned in romance option who the game forces you to make an awful decision to earn a brief kiss, and in doing so makes the suggestion that being gay goes hand in hand with a lack of morality. It all makes defending Finn borderline impossible.
Objection!
While Finn and his romance with Sean is undeniably messy, I don't think it's without its merits. For example, one of the complaints about them that I casually mentioned earlier was that they don't have chemistry. Of course, opinions are subjective, but that opinion, for lack of a better word, is bogus.
Finn is eager to frequently be physically and emotionally intimate with Sean. He calls Sean hot and reassures the older Diaz brother that any scars from trimming weed buds will make him sexier.
Finn lays it on thick. The amount of times I had to say flirt during that summary had me looking up synonyms. For the record, I'm not saying court, chat up, or woo. I saw some people call this side of Finn a character quirk, and while he uses similarly playful language as other characters to a degree, he doesn't show nearly as much active attention to anyone else as he does Sean, and that's including Hannah, someone he's actively sleeping with. It's to the point where Cass calls Sean blind for not noticing that Finn likes him sooner. And on the topic of Sean, it's easy to read this all as one-sided, with Finn being on the brink of pestering him, and that would be the case if Sean didn't have a pretty obvious crush on Finn too.
When Finn challenges Sean to throw a knife into a bullseye and Daniel uses his abilities to make his brother miss, Sean lashes out at Daniel. "You made me miss, in front of Finn." While he's evidently worried about someone realising Daniel has powers, I couldn't help but initially interpret it as Sean being upset that he looked bad in front of Finn, whom he constantly expresses an admiration of throughout the episode.
This, on top of the ambient sketching, confiding in him, appreciating his handiwork, and well, kissing him back, the mutual attraction is there if you want to see it. It's strangely authentic really, not to speak too much from personal experience, but this kind of casual flirty teasing seen in Finn, or Sean's subtle pining, is very true to flirting between men, especially when you're younger and less confident, and that goes tenfold on Sean's side when you consider that he's only just realising that men are even an option for him. It's only natural that he's being tentative. Of course, chemistry is subjective, and if you staunchly believe that Sean and Finn just don't make sense, I don't think I'll be able to convince you. However, it's when I see people saying that it came out of nowhere, I change my tune. Maybe you just didn't see it coming, and by the time they're kissing, oh shit, this came out of nowhere. If you've never been a man flirting with another man, or at least an appreciator of the art form, then why do you think you'd be an expert on picking up on it? Changing course, we can overlook their chemistry or lack thereof and look up, see the forest through the trees, and consider the implications that the only gay romance in the game is positioned as a bad moral decision. But that complaint is interesting because it's essentially a time capsule. A lot of the criticism, and there was plenty of it, mostly came right after the release of episode 3, and while you can't blame them for not being able to see the future, a lot of them failed to acknowledge that there's still plenty of story to come, and wouldn't you know it, Sean and Finn's story doesn't end in episode 3. After a time skip, Sean starts episode 4 in hospital, having been caught after the disastrous ending of episode 3, and awaiting trial for the numerous crimes he committed throughout the first 3 episodes. No one's perfect. Of course, he escapes, desperate to find Daniel, and on his way out of the hospital he spies that Finn is being treated in a room just by his, and you can choose whether or not to have a quick chat on your way to freedom. Finn, now you might find this hard to believe, immediately starts flirting. The two get past their pleasantries and he'll ask Sean where he's hoping to find Daniel, and if Sean doesn't answer, Finn very self-awarely understands why Sean doesn't really trust him. Following on from this, Finn gives Sean a very genuine apology, having clearly had plenty of time to think about how everything went wrong, and you can choose for Sean to accept or not. In my opinion, it feels the best to forgive him, even if it's perhaps a bit too nice. Finn will then tell Sean that he loves him and how much their kiss meant to him, and Sean tells him that he feels the same. Sean hopes that they'll meet again, but Finn just chooses to encourage him to go and find Daniel. While it by no means resolves everything, I do think it's good to get a genuine apology from Finn and consolidation that the romance actually meant something. At the end of episode 3, it's really easy to look at all the carnage and think this wouldn't have happened if it weren't for Finn, because that's true, so it's nice to not have that be the last impression from him and show that he's not a remorseless monster, and he did in fact care for Sean. While this is the last time we see Finn in person, later on in the dream sequence we can see Sean driving with his dad, the one who died at the start of the game, who brings up Sean's crush on a girl shown in episode 1. Sean can brush him off and then go out of his way to bring up his kiss with Finn, and it's a sweet moment. Later in episode 5, Sean will get a letter from Finn after he's gotten out of hospital and doing community service. He gives Sean his number and tells him to let him know when he's in Mexico, and then depending on the ending you get, there's a scene from 6 years after the main story where Sean will send Daniel a letter with a picture of him and Finn happy together on the beach just like Finn dreamed. It's a much nicer ending than they get in episode 3, but even discounting everything Sean and Finn related, there's still more gay characters in the game. Episode 4 sheds more light on Jacob, a character briefly introduced in episode 3, and while it's not given loads of attention, he comes out to Sean and talks a bit about the awkward relationship between his sexuality and the religion he was raised in.
It appears that the friend was actually cast out after first being forced through conversion therapy, but whilst the two teams were looking through files and memories of Jacob's past, the Christian boy shared that it always liked boys more than girls.
Then in episode 5, Sean has a friendly relationship with an older gay couple who live near where he and Daniel are staying, and in a funny moment, when Daniel tries gossiping about them with Sean, Sean can choose that moment to tell Daniel that he kissed Finn, much to Daniel's surprise but quick acceptance. While yes, it's understandable that queer fans of Life is Strange could have felt alienated after the ending of episode 3, I still think it was pretty hasty to assume that the Finn romance was the only queer rep they get in the game. But I get it, because ignoring everything I just mentioned, it still stands that Finn, the only gay romance option for the protagonist, is still positioned as a bad moral choice. But is that so wrong? Life is Strange 2 and Life is Strange the series is about hard decisions and morally grey characters. The series wouldn't be as interesting if every choice you were posed with had a clearly good or bad option, and the characters you were interacting with were clearly good or bad people. That's not to say some choices aren't more black and white than others. Having to make one of those rare, pretty obviously bad choices to romance Finn puts players in an uncomfortable position, and it shows in the numbers. However, I think it serves to make Finn a more interesting character. Not to constantly compare them, but I do think Cass being a more agreeable, in the right character makes her a little less dynamic to consider as a romantic partner for Sean. It's probably why, even though so many players chose to romance Cass over Finn, those who did choose Finn are a lot more passionate about that opinion. In being the more awkward option, I think Finn is a better representation of the series' theme of moral complexity. The people love an anti-hero, and while I don't think that term is perfect for Finn, he's definitely in that ballpark. What I'm advocating for is more messy gays. There's an outdated trope of all queer or queer-coded characters being solely villains, but now that homophobia is solved, the pendulum has swung and all gay people have to be paragons of morality. Studios, developers, focus groups and the like are scared of making a gay character a bad person or even having too many notable flaws, for fear is being labelled as homophobic, and honestly they have a point. You saw how people accuse the Finn romance of being anti-gay for making him the more villainous choice. Because of that, we're now suffering a drought of messy gays, especially in gaming. We're at that point now, at least I hope, that people can see a character from one group and realise they're not a one-to-one representation of every person in that group. If you think every man attracted to other men is willing to put a 9-year-old in danger for some quick cash just because Finn was, then I don't know what to say. Seek help. I understand the defensiveness around Finn's placement in Life is Strange 2 is a knee-jerk reaction, but upon further consideration it's much more valuable than just another standard gay romance.
I don't imagine any teenager experiencing their first same-sex attraction is going to do so without some, well, extra complexities. Does queer representation have to fit an arbitrary ideal? Should it be tied to notions of wholesomeness, the exploration of only positive moments, and the avoidance of the pain that comes with not just being queer, but also being human and forging intricate connections? Sean and Finn are messy human beings who can enter a messy relationship, and exploring the nuances in the messy, complicated parts of ourselves is something Life is Strange excels at doing.
Showing that gay people are capable of a wide array of emotions and autonomy is much more important than always being agreeable, because trust me, some of these homos are heinous, and I'd take 100 more Finns to avoid the more sterile alternative. Life is Strange 2, fittingly, if you make the choice, shows you two young men romantically attracted to each other who make an awful decision, both more than pay the price for it, have to unpack their complex feelings for each other, and can still end up happily ever after. Not to be dramatic, and it's not perfect, but it's a testament to why developers and audiences alike shouldn't be so scared of big swings and bold representation. It's interesting though, and depending on who you ask, admirable, that Sean, Finn and their relationship were presented without the use of any obvious stereotypes. But what if there was a character who was the complete opposite? Legendary, almost 40-year strong JRPG series Dragon Quest is known for many things, but representation is not really one of them, and honestly that makes sense. Not to give the series too much of a pass, but an undeniably classic, traditional JRPG series just isn't where you look when it comes to being at the forefront of diversity and representation. But that's part of what makes Sylvando such an interesting character. For now, the most recent mainline entry in the Dragon Quest series, Dragon Quest XI, released in Japan on the PS4 and 3DS in 2017. The PS4 version was released in the West in 2018, leaving the 3DS version as a bit of an obscure relic. And finally, a Switch Definitive Edition was released in 2019, with the editions being ported to other consoles throughout 2020. We play as a luminary, a chosen one surviving son of a fallen empire entrusted with a sacred power to save the land from evil. Yeah. On his quest to save the continent of Erdrea from the looming threat, he'll build a party of companions sympathetic to his world-saving course, one of whom being Sylvando. We first see Sylvando while the party is watching a circus performance in the desert kingdom of Gallopolis, and Sylvando is the star of the show. Throughout this chapter of the story, the incredibly flamboyant character will gradually get to know the party members as they help the cowardly side character Prince Faris build up his courage. While Sylvando is forthcoming and almost unnaturally friendly, it's clear that he knows more than he lets on, and seems to know quite a bit about the Knight's Code, strange for a circus performer. Once he works out the party's goal is to defeat the generic looming evil, he decides to join them since his personal mission is to spread smiles and happiness, and he sees their mission as the best method of achieving that. He sadly has to leave his horse Margarita behind in Gallopolis, but it's no matter because he offers the party the use of his personal ship, the Salty Stallion, which they'll need to progress on their journey. Notably, soon after this, the party makes a stop at Porto Valor, and Sylvando not so subtly refuses to enter the town and waits on the ship. They're visiting the town to meet Don Rodrigo, a notable knight, but since he's away, his butler Cervantes helps them and opens a gate that's blocking their way, and when they finally set sail, Cervantes notices Sylvando on the ship, but it's too late and they're gone. Fast forward a bit, there's a mid-game scuffle, the world falls into darkness, all the party members split up, someone dies, yada yada. Sylvando, understandably, is at his lowest, thinking that all hope is lost. He reunites with the charming captain of the Salty Stallion, Dave, and spends an appropriate amount of time moping, but then Dave literally smacks some sense into him and Sylvando's reinvigorated, and his quest to spread happiness is restored. They return to Gondolia, a port town the party had visited earlier in the game, and Sylvando gets straight back to his usual smile-spreading antics. He learns from a merchant that a new band of thieves are causing trouble, so, as is his nature, he goes to sort it out. As it turns out, the thieves are just starving fishermen who lost their livelihood after the oceans were filled with monsters after, you know, the spread of miscellaneous evil. Sylvando being Sylvando magics a spear into a baguette, and his charm instills the thieves with a renewed sense of hope. They're so inspired in fact that they plead to join Sylvando and become the first members of his personal party. They travel back to Gallopolis, helping people and recruiting a few new members on the way, and start preparing a morale-boosting show for the circus there. It takes a while to find enough performers to be in the mood for it amidst the apocalypse and all that, but of course he does, and it goes off without a hitch. More people are inspired, more young men are entranced by Sylvando's charisma and join his merry band, and they travel up to Hotto to meet the merchant Sylvando helped earlier. When they see just how happy he is after he's been helped, Sylvando is inspired and names his group the Soldiers of Smile, much to the glee of the members. The merchant makes him a float to carry Sylvando around on, joins the group himself, and the members then make Sylvando a parade outfit. He ends the story promising to reunite with the rest of the party soon. Later on, as the protagonist, who I'm sad to remind you is not Sylvando, is slowly rebuilding the party after they're all separated, meets up with Sylvando while he's travelling with the Soldiers of Smile. Sylvando, being, well, Sylvando, enlists the protagonist to join his group leading the parade. Also, new party member and Knight of the Capital, Hendrik, seems to think that he recognises Sylvando, but he can't tell where from. They travel together for a little longer, help free captives from an eccentric dragon, and on this mission, Sylvando reunites father and son. After, he's shown to be deep in thought, mumbling about being honest with parents, but he's soon interrupted. This is also when Sylvando realises that he needs to properly rejoin the party to really help the world at large, but can't risk the members of his travelling parade, so he requests that the protagonist help him find a safe home for them. He knows where, but he just needs support. The Soldiers of Smile, if you can wrap your head around it, are distraught, but understand his decision, so they head to Sylvando's pappy in Porto Valor. Hendrik realises where he recognises Sylvando from, and Sylvando teases Hendrik that he remembered him the whole time. As they head on their way, Hendrik is astounded, revealing that Sylvando is Don Rodrigo's son who abandoned the family name to travel with the circus and hasn't returned since, and that Rodrigo is likely still furious. Hendrik knows all this because as a knight he'd been trained by Don Rodrigo in his youth, explaining his foggy memory. Upon reaching Porto Valor, the protagonist and Hendrik go on ahead, and Rodrigo is happy to see that Hendrik had grown up so much. Sylvando will need a bit of extra encouragement though, and you'll find him waiting on the beach where he gives his version of events. He describes how he'd been trained since a toddler to follow in his father's footsteps, but all it took was one visit from a travelling circus to realise that that's what he was supposed to do. As you can imagine, his father wasn't happy with the career change, so they had a row and Sylvando left, never looking back until now. When Sylvando is finally in the room with his father, he's uncharacteristically sheepish, hiding behind the protagonist, but they're eventually face to face. Rodrigo is immediately shouting, and Sylvando starts madly apologising, but Rodrigo reveals that he's not angry, but disappointed Sylvando's returned home before completing his goal of making the whole world smile. It's unconventional but sweet to see how Rodrigo came around to supporting Sylvando's lifestyle, to the point where he doesn't want to see Sylvando until he's fully accomplished what he set out to do upon leaving. He still sees Sylvando as a knight and his goal of universal positivity as part of his oath, and Sylvando is overjoyed. Rodrigo is willing to take in and even train the Soldiers of Smile for Sylvando while he leaves to complete the main quest. He's understandably a bit shocked upon meeting them, but doesn't change his mind, so good on him. Sylvando says a tearful goodbye, unlocks an iconic ability, and goes on his merry way. While Sylvando is about for the rest of the game, and he's happily commenting on everything that happens in between, this is his main arc and the extent of his narrative relevance. Sylvando's motivation for wanting to make the whole world smile is almost excessively saccharine, and you might think that his overly flamboyant way of doing everything he does could be grating, but because he's so genuine, empathetic and good-natured, he's instead charming and one of the most popular characters from the game. Compared to every other party member, upon reflection, Sylvando sticks out for how little bearing he has on the core narrative. I was so willing to gloss over the main plotline of Dragon Quest XI, not because I don't enjoy it, but because even though he'll help out as much as he can, Sylvando has very little bearing on it. You'd miss him, but if you took Sylvando out, the story would be almost completely unchanged. I say all this to point out that you wouldn't think such a non-essential worker like Sylvando would be as widely liked as he is, but he is.
Famitsu published the results of their overseas poll for Dragon Quest XI-S, which revealed Sylvando as the most popular Dragon Quest XI character for international audiences. Critics similarly approve of Sylvando, with some considering the character to be one of the best features in the game.
It all culminates to make Sylvando not just one of the most popular, but just one of the across-the-board best gay characters in gaming. But Sylvando's not gay. Not sure if you noticed, Sylvando doesn't come out and his sexuality isn't mentioned. For all we know, Sylvando has a wife and we just never see her on screen and he just never mentions her. Honestly, if you think Sylvando's gay, then you're just falling for one big... Who am I kidding? Who's Sylvando kidding? Of course he's gay. You heard the summary, you saw the clips, you have a brain, you know that the writers, developers, anyone who had any hand in making Sylvando wants you to know that he's gay without having to say it outright. But that's the problem. While Sylvando is popular, he's not without his critics. The main issue these detractors cite is that his character is inextricably drenched in stereotypes. Even though nothing in the explicit text of the game tells us that Sylvando is attracted to men, every gay stereotype is used to point to that conclusion. Whether it's design choices, narrative motifs, almost every line of dialogue he has, even the affectation of his voice actor, the names of his attacks, his gaggle of effeminate male followers, and buff leather daddy, companion, are taking every expectation you have of stereotypes stereotypical gay person and saying that is Sylvando. While Sylvando's fans don't really have much of a problem with it, it's at the epicenter of his critics' arguments.
He is the most over-the-top and blatantly stereotypical representation of a homosexual I have ever seen. I have several LGBTQ friends and none of them, regardless of persuasion, act anything like Sylv does. Sylvando lisps like he has a swollen tongue in battle and stands like a prostitute. He felt very cliched and goofy to me, and I couldn't help but think, aren't we past representation like this?
But then at the same time, you'll have people who think it's reductive to fall for those stereotypes and to accuse Sylvando of being gay. They think that whether you like him or not, calling Sylvando gay is just reinforcing a negative perception of gay people.
The stereotype you are thinking of is of a flamboyant man, so Sylvando, being a flamboyant person, is going to seem that way if that's already the stereotype in your head. To me, that's more of a you problem. The game doesn't say that Sylvando is gay. If you want to think that he is, that's your choice. When I play, I don't think about it. It was simply his character. He's written as positive, supportive, and comfortable with who he is. That's enough for me. It doesn't really matter because it wasn't made relevant to the story. Anything else is speculation. Assuming Sylvando is gay based on flamboyancy is not doing any favours for the LGBTQ community. Nobody will ever convince me that making assumptions on identity based on stereotypes is a positive thing.
So on one hand, you have the people who hate the stereotypical way Sylvando is portrayed, and then the other that think if you fall for the stereotype, you're part of the problem. But all the while his fans are fully aware of these stereotypes, lean in and see it as a positive side of his character.
I'm queer and it's not rude to assume someone's gay. I think Sylvando is also broadcasting those signals on purpose because he's cool and confident in himself. I think Sylvando is great because he's a hero, and a major part of his heroicism is that he has the bravery to be true to himself. That's really in line with the themes of the game as a whole. I definitely see Sylvando's arc as parallel to the coming out experience many gay people have. I'm honestly just happy, if he is gay, which I think he is, to get some gay representation in video games, and I want more of it.
One user points out that the people who are getting the most offended about Sylvando are straight people on behalf of hypothetical gay people. Ironically, the thread a lot of these quotes are from is started by a straight person, albeit in good faith, asking if gay people are as offended by Sylvando as they are. Even if it's interpreted in different ways, the through line is, no matter which way you look at it, Sylvando is inseparable from the stereotypes that define him. So who's right? Is a character being so associated with stereotypes a bad thing? My gut reaction is yes. The word stereotype is inundated with negative connotations. No one is writing a character and actively aiming to make them a stereotype. The definitions don't really help the image of stereotypes either.
A standardised mental picture that is held in common by members of a group and that represents an oversimplified opinion, prejudiced attitude or uncritical judgment. An often unfair and untrue belief that many people have about all people or things with a particular characteristic. A set idea that people have about what someone or something is like, especially an idea that is wrong.
Unfair, prejudiced, oversimplified, wrong. The dictionaries aren't mincing their words. It would be easy and give me a nice simple conclusion if the use of stereotypes was actually so black and white, but unfortunately there's one extra factor that needs to be considered. I don't want to get anything twisted. Stereotyping has historically been used lazily and has rightfully earned its negative connotations. Not just gay men, but pretty much every underrepresented group has had to deal with stereotypes dominating their on-screen, on-page, in-media counterparts, and then had to deal with how this impacts their day-to-day life. However, for most groups at least, stereotypes are much less common now. They're still present, but we're now hyper-aware. It's why you get threads of people in good faith checking to see if gay people are offended by the stereotypes that Sylvando represents. So while stereotypes can and often will be used negatively, it all depends on how they're framed. Because stereotypes have been widely used to generalize and demean, it makes sense to have a knee-jerk reaction to not like a character if they're portrayed to have stereotypical traits. However, Sylvando is a perfect example of how a character can have these same stereotypical traits but frame them as positives.
If he was the butt of every joke, then it would be offensive. He's flamboyant, but he's also funny, caring and brave. Sylvando is accepted, liked and never shunned by the main party. They never so much as roll their eyes at him. Every character more or less who encounters Sylv is in awe of him, and his campiness or sexuality is never brought up as negative. I find that very refreshing. Some aspects of his role fall into stereotype, but the fact is that the game respects him and gives him a lot of depth and complexity while celebrating his time in the game.
While different characters definitely react to Sylvando, I'm not going to pretend that he's not eccentric. None of the party members ever try and put a damper on him or make him change, and more importantly, Sylvando is completely shameless and confident in how he presents himself, and rightfully so. His positivity is quite literally infectious, not only in how he affects characters in-universe, but in how likeable he is to the audience. He wouldn't be Mr. Popular of Dragon Quest XI if his behaviour didn't make him so beloved. Okay, but he's still a stereotype. That's why we've got to remember that stereotypes are usually based on, or at least sourced from, real traits, even if they can end up being misrepresented. The reason why stereotypes are disliked is because these real traits are exaggerated, twisted to be negative, and expected of every member in that group. That's what makes them so insidious. They take real trends and traits of marginalized groups and turn them into something to be ashamed of. It means that members of these groups, if they find themselves organically leaning into a stereotype, end up self-suppressing and censoring, and can even end up hating their natural behavior because they think that they're contributing to a stereotype. That's all a bit theoretical though. For example, some, and I can't say that clearly enough, some gay men are naturally a bit more flamboyant, but because being flamboyant has been portrayed as a negative stereotype, you'll often find gay men who naturally have this personality type suppressing it for fear of discrimination or being seen as bad representation for gay men. Then this will be reflected in progressive media and they'll overcorrect, and all of a sudden a good representation of a gay man doesn't include any of these potentially stereotypical traits, and it just reinforces and validates the belief that these traits are negative, even if it's your natural inclination. It's why a lot of people find Sylvando so refreshing. It's not just that there might be a couple of people who are exactly like Sylvando who see themselves perfectly represented, but it can be broken down into the litany of smaller traits that are encapsulated in Sylvando, all portrayed as a strength. You might not see yourself entirely in Sylvando, but you might see a specific trait that you've hated, for example being dramatic or overly expressive, or not being the picture perfect image of a typical man, and see it for once being shown as a positive attribute. It all contributes to his own special brand of heroism in Dragon Quest.
His bravery is unmatched in the party, and he often heroically comes to the aid of the concerned main character more than once, doing so with the utmost style. This is where his flamboyance works in his favour, as any time he makes a heroic save, he makes a grand show of it. Not because he wants the attention and praise, but because that's just how he is.
Well, he might want the attention and praise too, but that's beside the point. I'm not saying every gay character in gaming has to be like Sylvando, because then it would start to be a problem with this being seen as the only type of gay person again. But instead, Sylvando is who he is amongst a sea of stereotype breaking, gay guys who are actually normal too, gay characters, and if anything, that kind of makes him a stereotype breaker by being a stereotype reinforcer in a way.
There are gay people like him, and they are frequently good people like him. His whole arc gives me a feeling of, you can be a knight even if you don't conform to the expectations of masculinity. Let queer men be camp and flamboyant and extravagant. We made that shit and started putting it away for fear of weirding out the straights. Except fuck them. Sylvando is a gay character who isn't just a joke despite being the stock jester character class. While he still has some tropey flaws attached to him, he accomplishes one thing that many gay characters utterly fail at. He makes us feel like we can be heroes too.
Everything I've just said is put quite eloquently by a Reddit comment of all things in response to a thread on whether gay people should be offended by Sylvando.
The only offensive thing here is thinking that if a person is gay and they are at all effeminate, then they should be looked down upon or seen as a negative stereotype.
It alludes to the phenomenon of femme-hating within gay circles. It's an uncomfortable subject and I don't want to get too deep into gay hierarchies, but if you're unaware, in some gay circles, men who represent more effeminate stereotypical traits are looked down upon and deemed less desirable. It can be argued that this is influenced by the historically negative portrayal of these stereotypes and a sore lack of positive characters like Sylvando. This discomfort of being associated with effeminate gay men is mirrored almost perfectly in a thread titled "Anyone Else Bothered by Sylvando?", where the poster, a gay man, mentions how they dislike Sylvando's stereotypical traits and how it will empower homophobic perception of gay men. I'm not using this as an example to shame this guy for feeling this way, because he's clearly a little unsure about his opinion. That's why he's putting feelers out on a public forum to see if anyone else feels the same way with a relatively open mind, but maybe I'm giving him too much credit. Either way, the most popular response from another gay guy who admits to having struggled with Sylvando at first, then explains,
I think a big thing in our community right now is that being femme is a less acceptable form of gay, and that if you're loud and campy that you don't amount to anything more than that. I think the beauty of Sylv is that his actions and his battle prowess elevate him beyond just being a comic relief trope. I think the fact that this Dragon Quest included an obviously gay character and said, look, this guy's a badass, is actually a huge step in the right direction for our representation in JRPGs.
Unfortunately, this doesn't seem to get through to the original poster, who seems to want more ordinary guy gay representation, which on one hand I get, but I also feel like maybe he's not looking in the right places. Just in the first listicle I could find, with a couple of exceptions, it's dominated by normal guys who don't lean into gay stereotypes, whereas there isn't a character who leans so deeply into gay stereotypes as Sylvando and puts him in a positive light, attesting to my point that Sylvando is a gem. This value is recognised by one of the talents behind Sylvando, his English voice actor Shai Matheson.
I also love how he's been embraced as a gay or queer icon, and that people can see a bit of themselves in him, or feel like he represents them. I think it's great to have a different type of role model to what you would normally see in games. Sylvando just is who he is, and he doesn't need to fit into any mould.
Great point, and I'm glad he's proud of his work. However, his careful phrasing calling Sylvando a gay or queer icon and he's happy people feel like he represents them reminds us of something I haven't properly addressed yet. Sylvando still isn't actually gay.
Wakey, wakey, little soldier.
While there are excessive hints, and as we've established, plenty of stereotypes employed, he still isn't officially out. This is used as a counter-argument even by those who enjoy Sylvando for all the reasons I just listed.
One of the biggest faults in Sylvando's story is that he's never confirmed to be gay concretely. He never has any relationships with other male characters, and his penchant for attraction to men is only hinted at. This is a shame, and we need out and proud gay role models, especially if we want to inspire players who are still in the closet that being gay isn't just a thing we are, but that it can be awesome.
Honestly, they're fully correct. Everything I said about Sylvando would be notably more effective if there was just some kind of confirmation that he was gay. However, I do think there is a pretty strong counterpoint to this, that Sylvando coming out like that wouldn't be in the nature of Dragon Quest.
Sylvando is pretty much depicted as gay, as the game somewhat gives hints of his attraction being mostly directed at males. But romances aren't really the focus for anyone in this game, so he never develops any relationships with anyone. Nobody has sex in the Dragon Quest multiverse. People just live together and then a baby spontaneously creates itself. Sometimes the mother dies because of this.
That last one's a bit of an exaggeration, but it's true in a sense. Dragon Quest is not a particularly horny series. There are some allusions to sex, but generally speaking it would feel a bit strange in universe if Sylvando were to come out. But also, it's not entirely outside the realm of possibility either, so the original point still stands. Even considering that, Sylvando's sexuality is hinted at in every way except explicit, to the point that it might as well be explicit. But if you see it like that, it's really up to personal preference and opinion. On the topic of confirmed sexuality though, in Dragon Quest XI in particular, Sylvando isn't the only character who's implied to be attracted to the same gender. He's not even the only one in the party.
The definitive edition all but confirms that Eric and Hendrik are bisexual. If you ask either of them to help you with a wedding rehearsal quest, they genuinely think the luminary is proposing to them. Eric gets very enthusiastic, and Hendrik's only objection is that they haven't known each other long enough.
It's a very minor detail in a very optional mission, but the protagonist needs a party member to play his pretend partner in a wedding rehearsal. Eric will see this as making their bond official, and Hendrik, who hasn't picked up on the fact that it's a fake wedding, fully gets flustered and then accepts what he thinks is a proposal before he realises that it's not an actual wedding. Ironically, Sylvando is fully aware it's fake, so if you ask him, he, very in character, just talks about wanting to put on a good show. As it turns out, Eric and Hendrik might be more canonically into men than Sylvando. Like I said at the start, you wouldn't expect any of this from a series like Dragon Quest, and that's by design. While it's a pretty universally appreciated series and a staple of the video game industry, one of the key creators behind the series, Koichi Sugiyama, responsible for the iconic music behind the series, was well known for his extreme nationalist views, as in Nanjing massacre denial level extreme. On top of this, he had a history of statements against the LGBT community as a whole, but it seems like he might have softened on this over time, but not significantly. I bring this up not to congratulate Sugiyama for having let Sylvando exist, but more to say that Sylvando likely existed in spite of him. Not to shoehorn in a conclusion, but I think Sylvando represents a really strange niche of gay characters, and I think that's why a lot of people are unsure what to think about him. A running theme when discussing him has been initial expectations and impressions, and whether to latch onto them or leave yourself open to perhaps expanding your mindset. It's easy to have a knee-jerk reaction to how stereotypical Sylvando is, or how he's never explicitly confirmed gay. But it's in the nature of discussions about stereotypes to look past your first impression and try to see things for what they actually are. Sylvando is a stereotypical gay man, confirmed in every capacity except official, who's empowered by typically frowned upon traits to be a wholeheartedly authentic, positive and heroic presence within Dragon Quest XI's world. In my eyes, that makes him not just a rarity, but a blueprint for how to reframe stereotypes. My original plan was to have even more examples, but after finishing writing on Dorian, Sean, Finn and Sylvando, I realised those greedy bottoms had siphoned a lot of the good points I had planned for other sections, and the other characters I wanted to talk about were Niles and Leon from Fire Emblem, Jun from Persona 2, as well as Henry and Hans from Kingdom Come Deliverance. While I was quite happy with what I had planned for them, the points weren't as well thought out or relevant to an overarching topic, and since I'd already done separate videos on all 3 of them before, I felt even though I had new points to make, they weren't fully baked yet and my original points from those videos still stand. I didn't want to waste too much time self-plagiarising after all. There were other characters I was considering too, but again I didn't want to dilute and bloat. However, I'll talk about this more in the outro if you're interested, but if there's another character you think I should have spoken about or have something to say about yourself, I'll always love to see what you have to say in the comments. All that to say, I think it's been long enough that we might have forgotten why we're here. Dion very clearly has a boyfriend, but his story isn't defined by his sexuality. Dion definitely makes some regrettable choices, but he's by no means a bad person. And while Dion looks like a late 90s boy band member and his boyfriend has a charming fag scent, neither of them are particularly stereotypical, at least compared to him. So does that make him a good character, or by extension a good gay character? Well, as we've established, just because Dorian's story is centered around being gay, Finn forces Sean to tarnish his morals, and Sylvando is a big old stereotype, that doesn't, at least by my standards, make them worse characters or worse gay representation. So by that logic, does Dion not leaning into any of those traits make him better or worse in that regard? Let's put a pin in that because it's getting a bit too hypothetical again, and instead of talking about what Dion isn't, talk about what he is. So Dion, child prodigy, born warrior, sworn to protect his people, driven mad after he's manipulated into accidentally murdering his dad, goes on a rampage, kills a lot of his people, lengthy grieving process, final moments spent helping the good guys and dies in his final act of redemption, all while being gay. How does he find the time? Yes, Dion is perhaps clinically serious and his life is inarguably full of turmoil, but his arc being undeniably tragic doesn't hold him back from being a fantastic character. Sometimes it's hard to empathise with a character who always seems to be struggling and doesn't have many happy moments. However, because Dion is characterised so well and enough attention is given to fleshing out his supporting cast and his relationships with each of them, it makes him and his narrative incredibly compelling.
He's the epitome of dutiful, wedded to his people and what his kingdom expects of him. He's such a good man at heart, trying desperately to do the best possible thing in any given moment, but functionally betrayed by a system and region that consistently acts in their own self-interests.
His adoration of his father being muddied as he becomes more and more aware of his corruption, his antagonistic relationship with his scheming stepmother, his attempts at understanding Olivier hampered by his younger brother's persistent sociopathy, gradually morphing into murderous hatred, and then his final act perfectly represented by his short but sweet scenes with the healer girl, displaying his undying love for his people who he let down in the worst way.
She reflects the countless people Dion was supposed to be protecting when he ended up doing entirely the opposite. Seeing the reality of her life, coupled with the kindness she shows him, is what allows Dion to continue into the final act. He was ready to die there in the Dominion, collapsed amongst the wreckage of a broken kingdom. He can't give back the lives he took, but he can do right by at least the girl who helped him directly, and do his best to ensure the survival of the rest of Valistia, whatever the personal cost.
And of course his relationship with Terence, even though we don't actually get to see much of them together, especially within the context of just how many cutscenes there are in all of Final Fantasy XVI, what we do see is engaging. The voice actors have great chemistry, and the subtleties of their body language and the way they talk about each other, you come away from these scenes with a good sense of their relationship dynamic. However, these scenes with Terence are also the focal point for a lot of the complaints about Dion. Even though we get an idea of their relationship, we really have to stretch a lot from a little. The summary I gave at the start about Dion and Terence's relationship was honestly as comprehensive as possible. A lot of the details aren't even in the game, not even the codex. They were instead from the Final Fantasy XVI Ultimania, a giant guidebook, a standard for Square Enix games, and this one hasn't even been officially translated. There isn't even an easily accessible unofficial translation or scans, so I was really trusting wiki pages to not let me down when they were citing the Ultimania as a source. And while Terence serves his function well as a member of Dion's supporting cast, he is definitely just that. Terence barely exists outside the context of Dion, and everything we learn about him is closely linked to their relationship. Of course, not every NPC has to have pages of backstory, not everyone can be a main character, but even just a bit of flavor text at the end of Terence's codex entry would have helped. Like, Terence is Dion's right hand and lover, yada yada, he also loves crocheting. It would have gone a mile, but as it stands now, Terence seems like the type of person you'd go and meet for a catch-up, and all he'd talk about is his boyfriend. I mean, if my boyfriend was Dion, I'd probably do the same, but still. Back to the romance itself though, what we do get is fantastic. It does feel like it's slightly restrained. I understand that it was already bold of Square to include the romance at all, and I can appreciate them letting the game get banned in multiple territories instead of editing it out. But at the same time, if you're going to break boundaries, go for it. You don't nudge the envelope, you push it. For example, Dion and Terrence's one on-screen kiss. Well, get your binoculars. It's a strange directing choice for us to suddenly be watching them from all the way across the room just for one specific moment. I haven't studied film, maybe it's meant to imply a shock or a moment of reflection, or maybe we're meant to see how the whole world is standing still around them, but none of that registers on first viewing, and instead it's, oh, I think there's a gay kiss happening over there, but I need to squint. Compare this to the other romance scenes throughout the game, and well, Final Fantasy XVI really earns its 18 rating. Hot, heavy, intimate, naked. Compare that to the two men wearing 30 layers of clothing kissing over yonder. This might sound like the ramblings of a touch-starved homo mashing Ken dolls together, so it's probably a good place to point out that I'm not the only person who's thinking this way.
The two very clearly kiss, but the distance the scene is shot from would make it easy to think they hadn't. The limited scope of his relationship with his partner Terrence is such that it doesn't mean much to the story. But the fact that Square Enix feels gun-shy in the most intimate moments of the game's gay relationship is a symptom of a larger issue. The biggest franchises are still terrified to put queer people front and centre, especially men who like to kiss other men.
We aren't owed a steamy scene of Dion and Terrence trying to make babies, and the lack of this doesn't make either of them worse characters. However, it's just something you notice when compared to all of the other couples of relevance. I'm not saying that the reason Dion and Terrence don't have one of these scenes is because they're gay, but I'm not saying that it isn't. If we're scraping the barrel, there are some other criticisms of Dion, but the only other one of note that is worth acknowledging is that some people have argued that him dying at the end of the story plays into the bury your gays trope.
In the end, he did die in a spectacular manner, opening the way to Ultima and the final dungeon. This upset me to no end, and I admit that I became disconnected with the story after that. Square Enix has also taken one step back by having one of its first explicitly queer characters meet such a violent end. This fate is all too common for queer characters in media and remains a prevalent trend.
I get this, because bury your gays is ironically an undying trend. That's what makes it so annoying. But in Dion's case, I'm actually not that mad at it. Dion's death is devastating. Devastating because it's so earned and in a way rewarding. It's a culmination of Dion's redemption, and while no, you don't have to die to redeem accidentally killing a whole load of your citizens, in Dion's eyes, it really was the only way. Do I wish that the door was open for Final Fantasy XVI 2 Dion's happy retirement? Maybe a little, but I also think that Dion dying somehow respects his narrative arc in such a convincing way that I can't fault it. I focused on the faults and criticisms of Dion's character for a little too long now, then it might distract from the fact that in spite of these qualms, Dion is still one of the most beloved characters in the game and is treated as a perfect example of how you can make a character who, based on their amount of screen time, should really just be another side character, instead feel like a highlight of the story and a definite part of the main cast. The larger scale popularity poll put him at third behind Sid and Clive, insane considering just how much more time to shine both of those characters had in comparison. On top of this, there are multiple threads and videos all purely dedicated to praising him, all of which are overwhelmed with comments that wholeheartedly agree with his sentiment. It mirrors the praise Sylvando received for a similarly strong characterization, and part of the reason why I'm so happy with his feedback is that it proves that gay leading characters in a game, even with wildly different personalities like these two, won't alienate audiences or harm sales, but will instead be seen as a shining point of the game, and to some likely a selling point. However, when looking at the praise for Dion in particular, there's a strange trend I've noticed that is definitely worth examining. As established, Dion has been drowned in praise. There are of course many reasons why he's beloved, some that I haven't even been over specifically, but it all roots back to his strong characterization and his graceful implementation within the wider narrative of Final Fantasy XVI. However, there's a repeating sentiment I've picked up on when seeing how some people acknowledge how Dion's sexuality is treated.
A lot of times in gaming especially, you get gay characters and they hit you over the head with it. He just happens to be gay. They don't force the whole "I'm gay, loud and proud" thing down your throat like modern media does. I'm normally really good at telling what is actual good representation and what's just pandering. They cooked with Dion. He is a character woke writers should learn from for sure. He's a character that's gay, not a gay character. Diversity done right.
In isolation, these statements are easy to gloss over as background noise, but when compiled, they get increasingly frustrating, especially when you start to think about them. Why? Well, it's a symptom of what they are. Microaggressions. I'm sorry to the "it's not that deep" crowd, I know big words like that are terrifying.
Microaggression. A comment or action that subtly and often unconsciously or unintentionally expresses a prejudiced attitude towards a member of a marginalised group.
But what does that mean in this case? What makes microaggression so demeaning and malicious is that it's not really about the direct meaning, it's about the implication. People so often get away with microaggressions because when people call them out, it's really easy to retreat and accuse them of being aggressive or escalating or deeping it. I love that you don't make everything about your sexuality isn't a compliment. It's a badly obscured insult to hide frustration at gay people who have the audacity to bring up their orientation every now and then. So here, they're using Dion as one of the good ones, not really to uplift him, but to shit upon the wider, non-specific scope of gay characters they don't like. And for what? Hitting you over the head with it, not just happening to be gay, shoving it down your throat. These are intentionally vague and without actual examples because they just want to express their disapproval of gay characters existing openly and not being as perfectly demure about it as Dion is.
What I don't like is the amount of people using him to justify bashing on other queer characters. I see a lot of Dion as the good kind of gay that feels unnecessarily microaggressive. A character can be loud and proud of their sexuality, effeminate, reference their queerness directly and still be a good gay character. All kinds of people make up the LGBT community. Dion is a good gay character, but he's not the only type of good gay character.
You're allowed to complain about poor representation, and you're allowed to praise good representation. There are some really strong points made about how Dion isn't tokenistic and how he represents a type of masculinity that we don't often see with gay male characters. Fantastic, I don't see a problem with this. It's the comments instead that have the tone of liking Dion in spite of him being gay that are worth elaborating on. What do you mean that you weren't expecting to like Dion because you knew he was gay? That's a sentiment worth examining because of what it implies. Sure, it's better than people outright saying they hate gay characters purely for being gay, but at least that's forthcoming. Okay, I'm on one, we can roll back, because we haven't actually examined why Dion is being touted, by some at least, as perfect diversity done right gay representation. Well, it's because he's normal. Normalization of queerness is the end goal. In an ideal world, we'd all be treated the same and have true equality, but in a realistic world, you need to consider how that's actually achievable. Within the world of Final Fantasy XVI, Dion's sexuality is a complete non-issue. Outside of the scenes he shares with Terrence, there's barely any reference to Dion being in a relationship, and during their scenes, their gayness isn't acknowledged. Terrence doesn't stare at the camera and say, "We're both men." Honestly, that's great and it makes sense. With how much I'm talking about Dion, it's easy to forget that he's not really a main character, and because of that it would feel quite out of place for Dion to have a scene forced in where he has to come out to Jill or explain bottom shaming to Clive. Like I said, Dion's role within the narrative of Final Fantasy XVI is perfectly balanced and considered, and every scene of his makes sense for the game that it is. Maybe if Dion was the protagonist, we would have seen some Sandbreak royal advisor make a comment about Bahamut's deviant sexuality, or maybe Terrence would have mentioned his parents pressuring him to sire an heir. But because Dion's sexuality is so rarely acknowledged, we don't really even know if homophobia exists in this universe. What we do know is that Dion and Terrence aren't the only gay people in the game.
There's a soldier in North Reach who tells his male lover his fears about the coming war, and in one quest, Clive tells a pair of soldiers he's looking for a man. Looking for a man? Does this look like a brothel branded?
But like Dion, it's incidental and not brought to attention. I feel like I'm attacking this from a negative angle, so it's really worth pointing out that idealistic representation like this can be monumental.
He simply is gay. It has no bearing on the plot, yet has huge ramifications for LGBTQ+ players.
There is something so refreshing about seeing a gay character who is simply allowed to exist. While Dion doesn't exactly have an easy life, within the confines of his romance at least, there is no sexuality related angst. For people who might be struggling with their sexuality and unable to even consider accepting how they are, I can't begin to imagine how inspiring a character like Dion, who's clearly so past that stage, could be. This is one reason for liking Dion's style of representation, but it's not the only one. Those quotes praising Dion as one of the good ones don't exactly have the tone of cathartic queer joy. Who knows, maybe I'm misreading and a couple of them did, but I'm not going to give them all the benefit of the doubt. So why? Even if Dion has a fantastic storyline, he is quintessentially a side character. Even though I'm focusing on him so much, Dorian, Sean and Sylvando all had significantly more screen time and room for interaction and development. As mentioned, Dorian's relationship with his sexuality is a strong focus of his narrative, Sean's by awakening is given genuine attention, and Sylvando's whole arc is a thinly veiled allegory for coming out and self-acceptance. Because of Dorian's limited screen time, his sexuality is alluded to and briefly displayed. While that makes him a fantastic casually queer hero for those in dire need of that type of representation, it doubles up as a debate point for those who act like homophobia is a thing of the past, and gay people should really stop making such a big deal about their experiences. At first glance, wanting to believe that discrimination is over is innocent enough, if not blatantly ignorant. When you examine it though, it's much more harmful. In acting like homophobia is gone or even just downplaying its prevalence, you're effectively dismissing people who express how these issues still impact them, and telling them they have no right to complain since at least they're better off now. In doing what feels progressive to them, they're essentially hampering the open communication needed for the still pressing further progress that needs to be made. I mentioned it in the intro God knows how long ago now, but if any point here can be applied to other minorities or societally disadvantaged groups, it's this one, because this is by no means a rhetoric save for just gay men. It's like running out of a burning building and you're one room away from getting out and someone outside tells you to stop running because you might as well be outside. But I'm still in a burning building. Yeah, but you're practically out, and then they start closing the door and you're literally on fire. A bit dramatic, but you get the idea. Don't get it twisted, this isn't a critique of Dion. What Square did with him with such limited screen time was impressive. It's a critique about how some people use what Dion achieved to spread an occasionally uninformed, but at worst underhanded, way of thinking.
I think he's a good character who happens to be gay, which is what I think most people who want gay representation probably want. If his character was straight, just about nothing would change in the story. Him being gay changes nothing.
And that's great for Dion. Honestly, at this point in life, I find him the most relatable, in the sense that my sexuality doesn't have much of an impact on my day-to-day, aside from the basic foundations. However, like most gay people, that's not always been the case, and there nearly always is some kind of struggle that will vary depending on innumerable factors of life. These stories are also worth telling too, and we shouldn't pretend they don't exist to make certain people more comfortable. Final Fantasy has an interesting relationship with queer characters and themes. Bartz from Final Fantasy V was a bit bi, he definitely looks apart. The original Honeybee Inn from 7 happened, Quina from 9 is genderless, Vanille and Fang were clearly supposed to be together in 13 but it was removed last minute, and most recently with the 7 remakes there's been more subtle rep like Roche's homoerotic rivalry with Cloud, or something more explicit like the redone makeover of the Honeybee Inn and the very clearly queer-coded characters like Andrea. But Dion is really the first major, unignorable gay character. It's an upwards trajectory I really hope Square continues with, and I hope they take Dion's positive reception as permission to lean further in, rather than keep queer characters in the sidelines even if they flourish there like Dion did. Dion is of course one of the good ones, but one of many good ones, not a good one to stamp down on other, apparently lesser ones. But who's the best one? So, I haven't been entirely honest. Yes, I wanted to see if I could work out if Dion was one of the good ones by using other gay characters in gaming as examples. However, when doing so, I became possessed by the spirit of a woke scientist, trying to see if I could stitch together different aspects of different gay characters in gaming to make the perfect gay character. My Franken-Gay. Each of the characters I talked about, and plenty that I didn't, have different traits of their representation that were praised and traits that were critiqued. So if I get rid of the bad and keep the good, I can optimize the perfect in-game gay. So Dion was, generally speaking, liked for his portrayal of a more masculine gay man and how his narrative wasn't defined by his sexuality, so we'll keep those, but a lot of people thought that he could have had a bit more focus and screen time, so we'll get rid of that. Dorian's queerness was appreciated for how his narrative focused on pride in his sexuality and overcoming arduous circumstances by using a unique form of fantasy conversion therapy as a narrative device. However, after his introduction, he bears little weight on the overarching story of the game. Sean's portrayal of a teenager going through a bi-awakening was appreciated for being grounded and realistic, and Finn, while controversial, is appreciated as a queer character with a complex morality that's rarely seen. However, the fact that getting to see the depth of Sean's bi-awakening was completely relegated to making a terrible choice and ends up not having much relevance to his overall arc throughout Life is Strange 2 is regrettable. Sylvando's unconventional characterization of more stereotypically effeminate traits of gay men being shown as a strength and source of pride, all while being an undoubtedly capable hero, made him one of the most popular party members in Dragon Quest XI. However, his queerness is technically never canonized, and after the early game Gallopolis arc, he's not particularly relevant to the main story. Okay, those are all my samples. So, if we take everything we've kept, we end up with nothing. Well, the appreciation of Dion's lack of focus on his sexuality is kind of hard to keep when Dorian's sensitive focus on his sexuality was such a positive aspect of his character, so they can't really coexist. As for Sylvando, his strong effeminate traits are pretty hard to balance with Dion's hypermasculine take on gayness. Sylvando was liked for his unabashed heroism, but is that better than a more morally grey character like Finn? Sean's grounded bi-awakening is good, but is grounded inherently better than Dorian's utilization of allegorical fantasy discrimination? Who am I to say? It came to my attention pretty early on that this was a fool's errand. Of course, there's not going to be one perfect gay character I can hypothesize, because as much as I'd love to lump us all together, queer men aren't all the same, and that should be reflected in how they're portrayed in gaming and media as a whole. And while I don't want to get hung up on it, this can of course apply to other underrepresented groups as well. Like that quote said about Dion earlier,
Dion is a good gay character, but he's not the only type of good gay character.
While trying to make a perfect Franken-Gay is impossible, when sifting through the positive and negative traits of the characters I sampled, I saw that while a lot of the positive traits struggled to exist alongside each other, there was a trend in what was missing. Dorian and Sylvando, while party members, have little to do in the main story after their introductions, and even though Dion has more of a bearing on the plot of Final Fantasy, he is still very much relegated to his own section of the game. And while Sean is a main character of Life is Strange 2, his queerness is completely optional and not part of the main story. Similarly, Finn's attraction to men is only a passing comment unless you choose to romance him as Sean. Men attracted to men aren't allowed to be the main character or even a main player, and if they are, visibly being queer is optional. Quite ignorantly, I just assume that there must be a gay male main character in gaming, and not to discount this sector, but outside of indies that's not the case, and even within indies, while I know there's more, the only one I've played is Mediterranean Inferno, but I'll talk about that more at the end of the year. In a Reddit thread asking the same question, there were plenty of answers, but they all came with caveats, and it had commenters head scratching as to why there isn't a playable, non-optional gay protagonist in gaming. There are plenty of reasons why, but a lot of it stems back to homophobia still being such a big factor globally. A lot of people will counter that citing the prevalence yet still underrepresentation of lesbian protagonists, and while that still stands, I do think it should be examined why developers are more comfortable including lesbians in this capacity rather than gay men. It's not like it's all rainbows for lesbians, because a lot of that boils down to the imagined demographic of gamers being more comfortable sexualizing queer women. That deserves a whole video though, and I don't want to completely reduce lesbians in gaming to being fetishization, because that would be ignoring and devaluing a lot of great representation. Instead, I want to focus on that imagined demographic. While I'm sure it's not the only reason we don't have a gay male protagonist, a lot of it comes down to the fear of alienating the stereotypical straight male gamer. Movements like Gamergate and the more recent anti-woke mob have done irreparable damage to the image of who gamers are, when in reality, and they hate to hear it, they're a lot more diverse. More women than ever are gaming, and while women of course can play whatever they like, the critical and commercial success of games that are aimed at more female audiences are proof of this captive audience. And if you did your market research, you'd know that the most common gay subculture above twink and bear is annoying nerdy gamer. Certain gamers are trying to put their all into PRing themselves into being seen as a standard typical gamer, so developers cater for them, even if it seems like they barely actually play games a lot of the time and would much rather keep complaining. It's tragic that this strategy has been effective enough that companies have been too scared to make a mainstream gay main character, likely deeming it as too much of a risk, when other mediums have plenty of examples of their own. You could argue that no mainstream developer has ever had the idea, and it shouldn't be forced in if no one has imagined a gay main character when making a game, but I simply don't believe that in all the years of gaming being a thing, not one developer has pushed for it. But why should we bother putting so much energy into representing such a small part of the population anyway? When talking about representing a minority, especially about queerness, you'll inevitably see someone whip out statistics about how few queer people there actually are, followed by some implied or blatant statement about why we shouldn't need to represent such a small group. I could dive into the minutiae of how skewed these statistics are. Isn't it funny that all of a sudden there's more left-handed people when there isn't a stigma? But it doesn't really matter, because it's less about the fact that it's a specific percentage and more about the fact that it's not the majority. Why would you appeal to a minority when you can appeal to the majority? Surely that makes more business sense. Don't these companies want to make money? A little while ago I saw a TikTok from the developer of upcoming indie visual novel Rotten Roots, reading, "I spent 2 years creating a complex narrative game demo with 7 different endings, meaningful LGBTQ+ representation, and 200+ variables tracking player choices, and what did it get me?" The question at the end, just for context, was intended to align with the lyrics of the song playing in the background, and in an effort to clarify this is a grateful post instead of pity marketing, if you read the caption the question is answered. A community of players who finally feel seen in gaming, also the most rewarding creative experience of my life. It continues with his reinforcing how grateful he is, how passionate he is about the project, and mentioning that the demo is now available. However, the comments on the video seem to be focused on just one thing.
Pro tip, focus on the game being good and not whether it represents a particular sexual orientation. Might help your sales. Hope the modern audience you're catering to won't bankrupt you. Sorry to hear that, but if you want to sell good, you have to fit in good. Sadly, it sometimes means to not make what you fully want. You first need to find the audience, then make a game for it. Not make a game and then search for the audience. Because making a game for 1 to 3, max 6% of gamers is not sustainable, and that's a known fact.
I will admit, maybe the messaging of the TikTok was a little unclear thanks to the format, but still, these commenters were clearly foaming at the mouth to get this out of their system. I didn't have to nitpick to find these comments, they were literally flooding the video. While there were some genuine pieces of advice given to the developer, like recommendations to post more gameplay, it's dominated by the message that he shouldn't be considering representation at all, and to not bother since the game apparently won't sell well. And the thing is, technically they're right. He could shift his focus and market the game to a wider audience and maybe make more money. But why would he? He's clearly making the game that he wants to, and he's part of a small indie team, so it's not like shareholders are pushing him in a certain direction. And if meaningful representation is something that he values, then why shouldn't he? If you focus too much on the gaming sphere, you'll start to go mad. But it's just morbidly ironic that the same audience that are complaining about a lack of originality and games that are clearly put together by focus groups rather than creators are all of a sudden utilitarian sales experts when it comes to something that is clearly a passion project. Some of the best games are great because they're not aiming to please everyone, and instead made for a niche who will appreciate them. The same reasons I love Death Stranding are probably the reasons why other people hate it. While it very clearly won't be for everyone, Rotten Roots clearly isn't a game made for everyone, and it'll likely be all the better for it. When I started planning this, I was worried that I'd come to a conclusion along the lines of no one can be pleased, every gay character will inevitably be critiqued because no one can agree on what they want. And while there's an element of that that still rings true, I think there's a less pessimistic angle to take from it. Instead of trying to create a perfect one of the good ones, Franken-Gay, it's better to look at what made the gay characters I examined some of my favourites in gaming. There isn't one particular through line, but what unites them is that they're all represented authentically. Dion, Dorian, Sean, Finn, and Sylvando's queerness wasn't included to sell the games to a wider audience, but through a desire to represent different types of characters authentically, and in my eyes, that's why they succeed, and resonate with those who enjoy them. After all of this, we're more than aware that they clearly didn't resonate with everyone, but if we had a character who resonated with everyone, they would probably be extremely one-dimensional in a dire effort to somehow not piss anyone off. Well-written, intentional, and authentic gay characters like those I just listed have proven that they won't just resonate with those they directly represent, but can more than overcome identifiers. Sylvando and Dion especially had a litany of notably straight commentators mentioning how much they enjoyed the characters in spite of differing sexualities. Players can taste authenticity, and they'll naturally gravitate towards characters who have this extra effort put in. While yes, a gay male main character would be lovely, and we should always strive for continued improvement, I'm just happy that young gay gamers in particular now have such a varied range of representation that they can see themselves in so many different forms in all the games that they play.
1, 2, 3.
Ugh, such a well-meaning, genuine ending makes me want to be sick, but while it felt painfully saccharine to say, I unfortunately stand by it. I have a lot of thank yous I want to get through because there's so many people who helped me put this together. However, before I go through those, I just wanted to point out that after these acknowledgements, I want to go through essentially everything I cut. Yes, this video is long, but it could have been much longer, and yes, I know that sounds like a threat. Because I cut so much out for the sake of pacing and helping everything fit together, there's a lot which I really wanted to talk about but just didn't get the chance to, whether that's more of my thoughts on the actual games themselves or the games I was going to talk about but couldn't find time for, so stick around if you want to hear that. If you've enjoyed the video, it would be fantastic if you could give it a like. If you've listened to all of that and you have an opinion you'd like to share, then comments are always lovely, and if you want to see more of me talking about games, then subscribing would be much appreciated. I tend to prefer making longer videos like this, but I'll occasionally break it up with shorter uploads, but this is my bread and butter. If you want something similar, there's my Fire Emblem, Persona, and Kingdom Come Deliverance videos, all of which talk about gay characters, but with more of a focus on those specific series. But if you like to have a bit more variety in subject matter, there's my Mammoth Game Rankings where I talk about everything I've played throughout the year. Anyway, this video is made possible thanks to help from some amazing people. First of all, thanks to V for doing the thumbnail artwork. I think you can tell I love it with just how often I shoved it into the video, and I'm just incredibly happy with how it looks. I've been following them for a while, mainly because of their Naruto and Sasuke artwork, and it honestly felt like the stars aligned when they opened their commissions as soon as I started thinking about what to do for the thumbnail. Make sure to go and check them out with the links in the description. They're more active on Twitter, but they have a Tumblr page too. Massive thanks to Veylan for letting me use footage from their Dorian romance. I haven't played through Inquisition in a while, and the thought of rushing a playthrough of a pretty long game just to get footage sounded incredibly time consuming, so I'm incredibly grateful that they were happy to let me use theirs instead. They have footage of similar romances over on their channel, so if you want to see more, that's the best spot. A similar thanks goes to Sefre Plays. They consistently post long plays of JRPGs, letting people use them just for credit, so thank you so much to them. Channels like theirs are an absolute godsend. I also got loads of help from Jay and Annie. Jay helped give me some insight as I was writing the script. I wanted to have at least one other gay guy on hand to make sure I wasn't just talking completely out of my ass, and he's also the voice behind all of the quotes in the video, doing an amazing job as usual. Then, once the first draft of the script was done, Annie looked over the behemoth in record time, helping me clean it up and have it ready to go. Thanks to both of them, and it's just great to always have their support whenever it comes to releasing new videos. But anyway, like I said, this isn't really the end. That's everything that made its way into the final video, but what slipped through the cracks? At 14, in my religious high school, RE was mandatory on the curriculum from beginning to end. One of our tests had a question on the treatment of homosexuality in the church. Since I was clearly on one that day, instead of giving a more standard answer, I directly quoted a lot of my teacher's quite obvious homophobia in my answer from our lessons on the subject. When the marked papers were being handed back a few weeks later, that answer was covered in red question marks, and as soon as the class had settled, the teacher took me aside to a quiet room and asked me to explain my answer. I told him I was quoting things he said while he was ranting, and he found it funny that I called it ranting, and honestly in retrospect I do too. I don't remember the conversation verbatim, and I wasn't really told off, but what I do remember is that he said quite pointedly that he knows this topic is personal to me. Even if the closet was glass, I was barely out to my closest friends, let alone my RE teacher, so being clocked so officially in such a strange and early setting to my face has always stuck with me. In spite of bringing it up here, I don't have a specific takeaway from that conversation, but it definitely served as a reminder that so precociously acknowledging and challenging homophobia, or just talking about gay-specific topics, isn't standard and will likely be questioned. But that angry 14-year-old energy remains in some capacity, and I think that's why I don't really have any shame in mentioning sexuality in my videos whenever I want to, and with gaming so often being my main focus, I see this video in particular as a culmination of all that. How biographical. Anyway, I don't really know why I specifically chose to make this video now. Final Fantasy XVI is 2 years detached from relevance, and it's even longer for the other games I discussed. Even though I had quite a few ideas after making my Henry and Hans video, I think how much fun I had making that led me to want to keep talking about gayness in gaming with a slightly less specific focal topic. The base idea was wanting to talk about Dion and use him as a central character to compare other gay characters in gaming too. I didn't have a set roster of side characters to talk about for a long time, even after I started writing it, and that's the same with some of the points and themes too. It took a while for me to put together, so a lot of the ideas went in and out of favour, and because I didn't want it to feel too bloated, there's a lot that I cut. But because I put so much time into planning these topics, even though I might recycle some of the ideas in future videos, I at least wanted to acknowledge them here, talk about the idea, and how it might have slotted into the video you just watched. I'll start with the characters I was going to include, then move on to the themes, and then just talk a bit more about the games I did end up talking about, add some extra points or more thoughts on the games themselves, because I somehow still want to talk about them more. So if you're still interested, or if you're currently tied up and can't skip to the next video, sorry, I'll continue. So as I mentioned before, there were a lot of characters who I wanted to include. The three groups that got the closest were Niles and Leon from Fire Emblem Fates and Echoes respectively, Jun from Persona 2, as well as Henry and Hans from Kingdom Come Deliverance. I originally made a video on queerness in Fire Emblem back in 2023, and it was mainly focused on the then quite new and relevant Fire Emblem Engage, but I also included a pretty concise timeline of queerness throughout the series, which I then uploaded as a separate video too. In it, I mentioned even though I enjoyed Niles when I originally played Fates, how the choice for him to be the first canonical MLM character in Fire Emblem was a bit regrettable given his obsession with sadomasochism and relatively one-dimensional characterization. I still agree to a certain level because unlike a character like Sylvando, the hypersexual stereotypes he represents aren't really subverted and instead portrayed as character flaws. I could have used that as a comparison with Sylvando, but honestly I was looking to give him a bit more of a redemption arc. Something I hadn't done before making that original Fire Emblem video, I've since watched all of Niles' support conversations from the first Fire Emblem Warriors, where he was added as a DLC character. Unlike his conversations from Fates, these are all entirely voice acted, and it really helps bring him to life in a way he wasn't originally. Of course that makes sense to a degree. Being added as a DLC character as opposed to one of many cast members in a newly released Fire Emblem game lends itself to more attention. I think a dev likely saw the potential he had in Fates and wanted to give him a better chance to show off, and honestly he comes off a lot more charming here. His captivating personality and penchant for flirty teasing never strays into harassment, and these scenes are perfect at capturing his unique sense of humour. If you like the sound of Niles but don't want to commit to an entire Fire Emblem playthrough, then I'd honestly recommend the 20-minute compilation of his support conversations from Warriors. Also, maybe I was a little harsh on his characterization in Fates. He's not awful, it's just that he's maybe not the best choice for Nintendo's first openly gay character in a first second-party game. Then for Leon from Echoes, I honestly just fell even more in love with him when researching this, and he was definitely the hardest to let go of when choosing what to include. For the uninitiated, Echoes is a massive scale remake bordering reimagining of the original Fire Emblem Gaiden, and part of that process was adding support conversations and pretty much giving a personality to a lot of the stock characters from the original. For Leon, that meant making the sassy archer unavoidably shamelessly gay. He only has 2 sets of support conversations and you can watch both of them in less than 5 minutes, and it's amazing what they achieve in so little time. His first set of conversations is his fellow warrior Kamui, where Leon repeatedly assumes that Kamui is coming on to him, and instead of letting him down easily, he mercilessly compares Kamui to his actual crush Valbar, talking about how much of a man he is and going through all of his admirable personality traits. The consistent misunderstanding makes it a really funny 2 minutes of dialogue, and the lines at the end where Leon tells Kamui that if Valbar ended up not being his type somehow, he would instead start a journey to find another man who was. It's a really sweet way to just further establish his sexuality. Then of course, his other set of conversations with Valbar himself, and it's worth noting here that Echoes doesn't have romance, but even if it did, unfortunately Leon's love is unrequited. In the first support, Leon is casually flirting with Valbar, who then responds by telling Leon he's handsome and he could have any woman he wanted if he knew when to be quiet, where Leon responds by asking Valbar what he would want a woman for. The second shows Leon expressing how impressed he is with Valbar's continued will to fight even after avenging his family, and then in the last conversation, Leon brings up being pretty open about his self-aware struggle with unrequited love. Unfortunately, we never get to see Valbar's reaction or presumed rejection, but Leon admits to being happy with his feelings just for what they are, and how it's something he wouldn't change. For so little time, and with only having proper conversations with 2 characters, we get a really fantastic example of a gay male character open about his sexuality, with it impacting his characterization significantly, seen from a wholly positive perspective, and used tastefully as a source of humour. It's why I wanted to talk about him and maybe find a way to compare him to Niles, but I just couldn't find a way to make it work within the context of everything else and make it any more interesting than what I just said. Back in 2024, I released my set of gay persona videos and uploaded them in their intended full form after the whole series was out. Near the end, I have a short section acknowledging the existence of the Jun romance in Persona 2 Innocent Sin, a boldly included, if not that focused upon gay romance option for the protagonist, in a series that has struggled to say the least with queerness since then. I wanted to give Jun a bit more attention since I really enjoy his characterization and narrative relevance in Innocent Sin, but also as one of the earliest examples of a gay romance option all the way back in the Dark Ages, 1999, in what is now a mainstream series. I was thinking I could use this as a segue to talk about the history of censorship and how queer rep has progressed and evolved in gaming, with maybe even some sort of timeline. But the idea had developed in a way where I couldn't fit it in a natural way, and even just reflecting on it now, it might be a good basis for revisiting the topic in a separate video when I'm in the mood. Also, my Persona video being from just last year, it still felt a bit too soon to meaningfully revisit the topic. Then Henry and Hans, still incredibly relevant, and even though they have a whole dedicated deep dive video from me from just a few months ago, the reaction to that video actually brought a new aspect to my attention that I hadn't highlighted originally. Just to clarify, the reaction to that video has been overwhelmingly positive, and while I try to like and reply to as many comments as possible, I just wanted to take a brief moment to thank everyone who's even watched that video. I'm still really pleased with how it turned out. However, it did reach slightly beyond the standard demographic for my videos, and with that came some hate. Luckily, I'm not the type of person who's bothered by this, I'm secure in my creations, otherwise I wouldn't share them, but there was a strange running theme in some of these comments that I don't think I would have noticed otherwise. When talking about the realism of the representation of Henry and Hans' romance, there was a prevalence of people who really wanted to see the consequences of homosexuality from the era. Public hangings, being ostracized, branded, wanting to kill Hans for loving Henry. There was clearly a demand for medieval homophobic torture porn against Henry and Hans for daring to be gay. It's strange for 2 reasons, because Henry and Hans aren't publicly gay. They never get discovered during the sequel, and everything they do with a romantic context is kept hidden. So it would just be clumsy and misfitting based on what we see in the game for that to show up. Secondly, we do get to see these consequences, it just requires actually playing the game. There's a herbalist NPC who Henry is prompted to fight as the strongest fist fighter in the Trotsky region, and after you beat him you have the chance to ask him about his story and why he lives in isolation. He explains that he was chased out of, or really had to fight his way out of, multiple towns after his sexuality was discovered. Honestly, he probably would have been killed if it weren't for his ability to defend himself. It's realistic, and Henry's reactions are mostly sympathetic, fitting for a bisexual man. So I wanted to discuss the homophobic roots of this strange desire to harm queer people in-game, and maybe just examine where that came from. I also had the idea to use the gay romance in the game, paired with the game's massive success, as a point about gays in games and how that impacts sales, but as you saw, I kind of ripped it up and reused it in different sections. What I probably would have mentioned though is that if anything, I think the Hans romance potentially increased sales of the sequel. It pushed a lot of the game's early and continued social media presence and ensures that it's still in the public eye after the initial launch window hype died down. For every anti-woke gamer put off, 10 Fujos are recruited, and honestly, that's capitalism. Also, if Persona felt a little too soon, KCD definitely did. It's still my most recent upload and I didn't want to beat a dead horse, even if it isn't really dead, but you get the point. So on top of all these guys, I also wanted to maybe have a lightning round where I spoke about characters like Greg and Angus from Night in the Woods, Johan from Eternights, Bill from The Last of Us, Thanatos and Zagreus from Hades, Kim Kitsuragi from Disco Elysium, Kerry from Cyberpunk, various Mass Effect gays, the gays in Mediterranean Inferno, and even Hades from Kid Icarus Uprising. They were all relegated to a hypothetical quickfire since I either didn't have much to say, much experience with the source material, or once again, couldn't make it fit. But if you want to hear specific reasons for each, let me know in the comments and I'll happily answer. And on the topic of comments, if there's a character you think I missed out on, or maybe don't even know about, or just want to talk about yourself, I'm more than interested to hear what you think, so including that would be amazing. Since these are ideas rather than specific examples, a lot of these ended up sneaking their way in more subtly. For example, the Henry and Hans section was going to focus on how gay characters affect sales, but that ended up making its way in elsewhere, and the Jun section would have mentioned censorship, but that got some vague allusions elsewhere too. The Sylvando section actually ended up being a bit of an orphanage for ideas I had grander aspirations for. There I mentioned the phenomenon of femme-shaming within gay circles, but I also wanted to touch on how gay people can sometimes be the harshest critics of gay rep. While you can't beat the unadulterated hatred found in homophobia, you'll always be a better critic with personal experience, and I think you can see that in a lot of criticism of gay characters in gaming. I think this could easily spawn a different type of conversation, but that needs more focus than a side point, and I wanted to give it that respect instead of making a passing comment that sounds like an unnecessary dig against my own community, even if it's true. And when discussing Sylvando and stereotypes, I wanted to dedicate some time to pointing out the similarities between stereotypes and subtext. Subtext being hidden details in media alluded to through hints, themes, etc. Like when you think about it, it's similar to how stereotypes are used. I started writing it and got pretty far, but then I spent a good few hours staring at where I left it thinking, how can I make this relevant? How can I link this to everything I have to say about Sylvando? And the answer was I couldn't, so I didn't. But once again, I might end up digging it back up in a new scenario at some point. While we're on Sylvando, even though it's not a topic I was ever really planning to discuss since it's a pretty massive left turn and also something I'm not qualified to talk on at all, there are some pretty major differences in how Sylvando is portrayed in the Japanese version of the script to the English. In the original Japanese, there are conversations around whether Sylvando is intended to be somewhere under the trans umbrella, but this is unconfirmed and embroiled in debate, and I couldn't really find any conclusive information on it. While the potential changes made to Sylvando are interesting, it's clear that some fundamental aspects of the character were changed upon localization, to the point where they can be considered separate entities in my opinion. But because I don't have easy access to the Japanese script, nor do I understand Japanese, I think I would have been woefully lacking if I tried to tackle this side of Sylvando's character. Changing topic, some behind the scenes for you. When I research my videos, I tend to mainly stick to articles and written work instead of other videos. While I'll sometimes watch them to support other research, I'll tend to avoid it since I don't want to end up accidentally recreating someone else's whole idea. Instead, I'll usually watch them after I finish a video as a bit of a prize for getting it done. For example, there's a video that also tackles Sylvando and his relationship with stereotypes, and when I flicked through it and had a glance at the comments, I plan to properly watch it once this is out. I say all that to bring up one video that I did watch and plan to use for inspiration was Rantasmo's 9-year-old video called Are LGBT Characters Forced into Games, where amongst other things he makes a point about the difference between flat side characters and rounded main characters, and the importance of both when representing different groups in gaming. It's a great video focusing mainly around some then topical controversy surrounding Baldur's Gate, and I'd recommend watching it since I essentially couldn't find a graceful way to implement or reference it in the main body of what I made. If anything, it's just another example of why I don't use many videos in my research, but I'm not committed to that, so maybe more comment bait, but if you think there's any videos I might find interesting, let me know. The only other point I couldn't find a natural way to include was race and intersectionality. I'm really happy I found a pretty diverse pool of gay characters to choose from, and I would have loved to have spent some time acknowledging the intersectionality of this, amidst other points. However, every time I tried to point this out, it kinda just felt like I was shoving it in, and not giving it the proper attention it deserved. Like, it would have been nice to include a black gay character like Steve from Mass Effect, or a trans gay character like Tyler from Tell Me Why, but I came to the conclusion that including them just for those reasons would have ended up feeling tokenistic, and it's better to wait until I've actually played their games, and seeing if I have anything to say about them in a potential follow-up video. But because of all that, I wanted to mention it here, and if you guys have any thoughts on it, I'd love to have a conversation about it in the comments. So that's the lion's share of what got left out, but as I got further in, I found myself wanting to talk more about the games themselves. I spent enough time summarising the characters and their place in their games that I didn't want it to morph into something more akin to a review. However, that doesn't change the fact that I still have things I want to say about these games. One type of video that I love to make the most in my end of year game rankings, being how I play an exorbitant amount of games every year, and for the last few years I've enjoyed making long ranking videos where I give myself a couple of minutes or so to talk about, and of course rank every game I played played that year. If that sounds interesting, I'd recommend you check them out, but for all but one of the games I talk about in this video, I didn't play them this year, so I won't be able to talk about them at the end of the year, and even if I did, I don't think I really want to wait that long. So in order of when I played them, in the summer of 2016, I picked up a pre-owned PS3. I bought a friend's Vita the year before as my first Sony console, and I thought that since the PS3 has such a wide back catalogue and the games weren't too expensive at the time, it would be the perfect chance to dive even deeper into PlayStation's library. While plenty of games motivated this, one which I wanted to try in particular was Inquisition, largely because I'd heard about Dorian. Sure, the game itself looked interesting, even if potentially not the best entry point to the series, but I wanted to romance that damn mage. As a Nintendo purist up until the Vita, I'd been stuck with Nintendo's wholly family-friendly what are gay people shtick up until that point, and they'd only really started dipping their toes in just earlier that year with Niles and Fates. But a character like Dorian and everything I'd heard about him made the prospect of playing Inquisition, especially when I'd played pretty much no games as gay people before, incredibly tempting. I quickly learned that my poor, already pre-loved PS3 could barely handle Inquisition, so playing the game wasn't exactly the smoothest experience. At the time, I remember it looking good and enjoying the gameplay to a degree, but let's be real, it was a Dorian-centric, Dorian-motivated playthrough. That's to the point that I don't actually think I finished the game after completing the Dorian romance, but it's been so long I honestly can't remember. My main takeaway from the game was absolutely loving Dorian, no surprise. His character quests and romance were fantastic, but one moment of it was kind of ruined for me. Bear in mind that this is almost a decade ago, but during the climactic scene of the whole romance finally paying off, one of my parents walked into the room and started talking at me about something. I'm not sure if you remember how far gaming has come, but back then Inquisition didn't have pausable cutscenes and the PS3 home menu was just an overlay that wouldn't stop the gameplay underneath. So I was stuck, annoyed that the scene was being interrupted and I was missing out on it, but also terrified that they would look at the screen and see what was happening. The rest is a blur, but that awful timing is a core memory. Going back to rewatch the entire romance and research the game was a big part of the fun for putting this video together. It is nice to see that I don't have nostalgia goggles and his character is just as good as I remember. While it did have me tempted to replay, I'd much rather do my due diligence and catch up with the whole series instead. I hear so much about how good Origins is that I should really just play it at this point, and I'm sure I'll probably enjoy too in spite of its mixed reception. And then I'll get back to Inquisition with more context and then looking forward to once again romancing Dorian. Ironically, I already played Veilguard this year, mainly because I like the look of the character creator and I had fun with it. It was also nice to have the Dorian cameo there, even if it was brief. All in all, this has really re-incentivized me to give the Dragon Age series a proper chance, but since they're such long games, I'm not going to rush it. Soon after it was first released, I was lent a friend's copy of Dragon Quest IX on the DS because they were struggling with an early game boss and wanted me to help them beat it. I did, but I also played much further ahead in the game after that because I ended up really enjoying it. I then picked it up again for myself when I was a teenager, got much further, but never finished it. While I've never been a hardcore fan of the series, because of this early experience, I've always been passively fond of Dragon Quest. I was sad that 10 never got an accessible release outside of Japan, but it made me all the more excited to play 11 when it finally got its Switch Definitive Edition in 2019. I finally actually played it in early 2020, and it ended up being one of my all-time favourites. One thing I love and look for in RPGs is detailed and interesting settlements, and I feel like that's something Dragon Quest XI nailed. Every corner of the world felt so inviting to explore, and it was a game that I just felt like I could take my time with and soak in every moment of. As I established in the Sylvando section, while the core premise of the game isn't revolutionary, it was told incredibly well, and I just wanted to know what was happening next and where it would take me in the world. On top of that, the party made every story moment so much more enjoyable to experience. Of course, Sylvando was a highlight, not just for me, but seemingly everyone else who played it. Even though he doesn't actually get that much to do in the game, especially if you take out his bonus episode from the Definitive Edition, every scene he is present for, he enhances simply by being there and quipping, or just doing something stupid in the background. It really gets into Glaze territory at this point because pretty much everything the game did, I loved. Maybe the third act went a bit off the rails and the end game got a little grindy, but that's really par for the course with RPGs. But aside from these small issues, I just remember it being an overwhelmingly positive experience. It's been a while since I played it now, so maybe it deserves a replay, but at this point I'm more excited for 12 when that eventually comes out. I'm not going to say too much on Final Fantasy 16 since I already said a good amount in my 2023 ranking. I mean, look at Dion sitting pretty in the middle of the thumbnail. I'll restate though just how much I love the effort Square put into making the storytelling in this game so easy to follow. Being able to pause at any time and get definitions, and then going back to the base and looking through the interacting evolving map and relationships timeline just made it so much easier to get immersed and enjoy such a narrative driven game. It definitely wasn't perfect. I really disliked how small the explorable settlements were and how all the big cities were only temporarily available, and when they were, nearly always in the middle of being destroyed. Especially when compared to something like Dragon Quest, while the world felt alive narratively, gameplay wise it just never felt like I was actually exploring the world, just segments of it, and if anything that killed the immersion the most. Also, while I loved controlling Clive and how dynamic his moveset was, the game felt pretty lonely at times. I think it was part of the dour tone they were going for, but I feel like the game would have been a lot more memorable if you spent more time actually adventuring with other people. Sure, there were temporary party members, but they were so temporary that I barely remember where they were present only 2 years later, and while Torgal was a fun addition, I'm more of a cat person, sorry. Not to always bring it back to Dion, but I think he would have been the perfect late game party member if the game had a more traditional party system. I felt that a lot of the side characters, Jill in particular, would have been really more interesting if you got to spend more time with them, so having a party system would have made it even better, and it would have made already great characters like Sid and Dion shine even more. Saying all this, I don't like critiquing games for what they're not, because they're not that, they're what they are. In this case, I'm more hoping for the slight changes in how the next mainline Final Fantasy manifests. 16 is a weird game because it's one that I genuinely enjoyed a lot, but I find it really easy to gloss over what I liked and focus on where it could have been better. But honestly, it'll always be high in my regards for being the game that gave us Dion. I don't exactly remember why, but Life is Strange 2 is the only game I played specifically for this video. I have a close friend who's played and enjoyed it, so it's been in my periphery for a while because of that, and after mentioning in my last video that I hadn't touched the series, I got a few comments encouraging me to check it out. I'm pretty sure that I had a click moment of, oh, I should play this game for the gay video I'm planning, but that reason has completely escaped me. I didn't even know that much about Sean and Finn's relationship going in and saved researching it until I'd finished episode 3, so nothing to do with the particulars of that romance could have motivated me either. Potentially concerning lack of memory aside, I did play it, and I'm happy that I did, since I had a great time with it. Soon after I started playing, Jay came in and made fun of Life is Strange style games, mentioning how it's a lot of walking around rooms and commenting on everything inside. This is my guitar, I miss playing my guitar. And yeah, it's true, and it was kind of a funny distraction for the first couple of hours, but while he finds that grating, I honestly think it's a good way of getting to know the characters. It's part of the reason why I really enjoy Sean as a protagonist. He's put in some really awful circumstances and he doesn't always deal with it well, but because you can relate to him so much, or at least I could, it meant that he was never hateable. Also, the inclusion of his journal and being able to fill in the gaps between episodes with his drawings was just a really great way to make the whole journey come together. I mentioned it a few times during the main video, but it had a great selection of choices that often had me struggling which to choose, and it made how the story turned out quite rewarding. Maybe it reflects poorly on me, but just by choosing based on my instinct, I ended up getting quite an evil playthrough, but honestly I'm not mad at the ending that got me. For those in the know, it was a Blood Brothers ending, and while it's technically supposed to be one of the bad ones, I honestly wasn't that mad. While I'm pretty sure I made my opinions on the Finn romance pretty clear during the main body, I do want to clarify that I really enjoyed it. Getting a more morally complex romance made it all the more engaging, and I really liked how it didn't have the typical predictability that a lot of standard in-game romances have, even if that meant making some more uncomfortable choices. Not to shamelessly plug some more, but I'll save the rest of my thoughts for my 2025 ranking, so make sure to keep an eye out for that in December sometime. Usually the ends of my videos are dominated by all of my thank yous, but with those already out of the way, I'm unsure about the most graceful way to finish this video. I do have one more thank you though. In this section I use Fire Emblem gameplay from Just One Gamer, another Let's Play channel with loads of clips on JRPGs in particular, so check them out if you're interested. If you're still here, thank you for getting so far through. This postscript section was a little experimental for me to talk more freely about what goes into making a video, and just letting myself talk about what I want to without justification. So if you enjoyed it, let me know, and if you didn't, don't. You'll hurt my feelings. I usually use the very end to talk about what I might post next, and that nearly never ends up happening, but whatever it ends up being, subscribing is the best way to see it as soon as it's out, and I also really appreciate it. If you have thoughts about anything, even if you just want me to clarify something, leave it down below and I'll always try and get around to any questions when I get the chance. Thanks again, and hopefully see you soon.